Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell. We can finish here. The head of the legal department of the ECO Construction Company folded the documents neatly into a plastic folder and smiled. Gentlemen, I suggest we finish our meeting at the restaurant. There's a great seafood restaurant here at the hotel. The table's set. We can go downstairs right now. The deputy general manager waved his hand hospitably toward the elevators. I sighed. We had just signed a lucrative contract that our firm had been pursuing for years. But the last thing I wanted to do was spend the evening in a restaurant. To be honest, I missed my wife and son. We've been living together for 5 years now, but I still lose my head like a boy when I see my wife. I guess I'm a one-woman man, and there's nothing I can do about it. I can't bear to be away from my family. As I stacked up the signed papers, I puzzled over what reason I could come up with to go home today. If I leave now, I'll be home by morning. True, it's quite a long drive, almost 500 kilometers. But that's okay. I have long been used to long distances and abnormal situations. Ever since I was in the Army, Robert, I'm very embarrassed, but I won't be able to attend the banquet. There are problems at home, so I'm leaving right now. In any case, you will visit our firm soon, and I will do my best to make up for my departure today. I made up an excuse on the fly and now tried not to look in the eyes of the general. That's okay, Christopher. After all, the banquet is not the main purpose of our meeting. I think we still have a lot to do. Robert smiled, and we shook hands firmly. In my room, I changed my clothes, packed my shirt and business suit in a plastic bag, pulled on the usual camouflage for the helm of my boots, and put a silver medallion on a leather lanyard around my neck. In such clothes, I felt much freer and more confident. Without wasting time, I threw my things into the car, checked the note, and in half an hour drove off the ring road onto the highway leading to my hometown. At home, thank God, I was fine. No problems. I just wanted to hug my beloved wife and son quickly. Gradually, it was getting dark. It was early fall before the prolonged rains, and the first frosts were still far away. The road was deserted. Only at the bends roadside bushes sprinkled on me, caught out of the darkness by the headlights of my car. The engine ran smoothly without strain. I lightly stoked the gas pedal, bringing the speed to 120 kilometers per hour. The cruising speed of my car. I myself rebuilt the engine vectors, spent almost a month, rewelded the sills, scaled holes, and painted. The car is a real Japanese, made for the USA. Got it to me for a ridiculous price. I remember the surprised, squeamish face of my wife and brother, but frankly, I didn't care about that. The main thing was that I liked the car. My grandfather, my father's father at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, confidently held on to the chair of the general director of the metallurgical plant. I don't know how, but after a while he became its owner. He managed in this turbulent time not only to save the plant, and accordingly, the workplaces, but also by carrying out reconstruction, to reach the leading positions in its branch in our country. Time passed. The plant prospered. Grandfather managed to buy and build several more production facilities, expanding the scope of his activities. One of the new areas of activity was the organization of production of steel structures for construction. This direction was headed by his son, my father. Today, on his behalf, I signed a lucrative contract for the manufacture and supply of steel, load-bearing beams for a huge construction company, bringing my father's firm to a new level. But despite some independence, all the threads of management of the huge household were at my grandfather. There are 2 of us in the family, me and my brother. We are twins. We are already over 30. Untrained people can't tell us apart. At first, our parents could hardly distinguish us. I'm the oldest. 20 minutes after I was born, Stephen was born, and that sealed my fate. I don't know why, but my parents gave all their love to their younger son, forced to measure with my existence. Everything was for Stephen. Toys, tutoring. As the eldest, I had to defer to my younger brother in everything. No one was interested in my interests and desires. Stephen went to tutors, studied music, always wore a clean suit, and learned good manners. I grew up on my own. I taught myself to play guitar and enrolled in the hand-to-hand combat section. I studied averagely, but after the 9th pressed on studying and soon was in the first 5 on academic performance. What to be? I didn't think much about it. I was easily given to exact sciences, and I was going to enter the Mechanical Engineering Institute, but life arranged otherwise. In 11th grade, I fell in love. The girl was wonderful. Our relationship was extremely serious, and we decided to get married right after school. Adriana was also going to university. We decided to be a couple and live together in a dormitory. They were willing to give us a room. I took everything into account, except one thing. 2 weeks before the wedding, when I had already bought the rings, Adriana called me and stammered and asked me to meet her. Okay, no problem. We agreed to meet at the park near the fountain. I knew the place well, as I often went there with Adriana to dance. I arrived early and had time to smoke while waiting for the bride. Finally, Adriana appeared, and not alone. She was holding Stephen, dressed in his trademark jeans and leather jacket. When she saw me, she abruptly let go of his hand and came over to me. "Hi, you've been waiting a long time." As if it mattered now, it was clear to me. Stephen couldn't get over the fact that I had a girlfriend. Like everything else, she had to be his. I shrugged silently. We don't need to see each other anymore. My ex-fiancée carefully averted her eyes. All the sorrow in the world seemed to be centered in her shaky voice. I was in love. Adriana, I understand. I don't need to explain. I caught my brother's triumphant look. I turned and headed out of the park. The next day, I went to the enlistment office and applied to join the Army. My father was indifferent to my decision. I did not voice the reason for my decision. My mother didn't care about me. She was busy with another extended shopping somewhere abroad. So within 2 weeks, I received a summons, passed a medical examination, and was drafted into the internal troops. At the recruitment center, I was sent to the intelligence of internal troops, having scrutinized my body for the presence of tattoos. On my perplexed look, the warrant officer paramedic said a tattoo for a scout as a business card. It remains to fill the last name on the ass for full happiness. Remember, kid, tattoos are for prisoners, morons, and prostitutes. And so began my service in intelligence. I was a tough and stubborn guy. Soon I began to do well in the service. By the end of the first year, I was already a sergeant, a squad leader. I tried to study military science well. I finished sniper courses, learned to drive a car in extreme conditions. I achieved good results in hand-to-hand combat. I was offered to take tests for the right to carry a green ticket. I passed them the first time. Several times I was in hot spots as part of my company. For participation in one operation, I was even awarded the Medal of Honor. I don't know for what reason my call sign was a connecting rod. It happened 2 months before the end of my service. I was ordered to take an artillery adjuster to an observation post and cover him while he worked. The winter sun was already rolling toward sunset. It got very cold. Breathing scouts. Fog beat between the leafless trees, sticking out here and there on the slope, from where the adjuster dictated the coordinates of the targets. Finally, the crimson sun was finally hidden behind the horizon, which meant that not a single ray of it could give us away, repelling the attack through binoculars or telescopic sights. In the distance, a mountain river rushed southward with a gray ribbon. On its left bank, the enemy was concentrating its forces. The task of the squad was as simple as a song, to stay undetected for as long as possible, and to identify enemy targets as much as possible, and to get away as quietly as possible. Further worked artillery. The adjuster was already finishing to transmit the coordinates. The target, as on us from the rear, struck a machine gun. Bullets with a horse crashed into the world-evil ground. Around me shrieked and dropped his head adjuster. I snapped back with short bursts from my Kalashnikov rifle, trying not to let the enemy get too close. It was completely dark, and I could barely make out the silhouettes of the enemy. I tried to contact the company commander over the intercom, but there was only crackling in my headphones. The enemy is competently jamming our frequency, not giving the opportunity to establish a stable connection from our side. No one was firing anymore. My fighters were probably all killed. A click and my machine gun went silent. I was out of ammo. I pulled out my Stetkin pistol and pulled the bolt. Two shadows rushed toward me from the right, not aiming. I fired several times in their direction. It seemed to hit. I realized that I could not get out. But that was the order. I turned to the kilt adjuster and, covering myself with his body, I flicked the radio switch, switched to the spare frequency, and began to transmit my coordinates, thus calling the artillery fire on myself. The machine gunner detected my movement and opened fire again. I felt the bullets pounding into the dead body. I wasn't scared. I was just mentally dead already, clearly realizing that only a miracle could save me. The last thing I remembered was the whistling of shells and the rumble of bursts all around me. Then the remnants of my squad made their way to me and pulled me stunned to the rear. I didn't even have a scratch, just a slight contusion. Apparently, God still needed me for something. Just before I was discharged, we who survived that battle at a jeweler we know, we ordered medallions as a souvenir. The material we had was a broken silver cross we found in a ruined Orthodox church, enough for everyone. Only 7 people survived that battle. The time of service flew by quickly, and I was soon demobilized. I took away with me the medal for bravery at the station. To my great surprise, I was met by Zareknaya, former fiancée. Adriana frantically clutched at the sleeve of my camouflage and sobbed hysterically, asking for forgiveness. I even felt a little sorry for her, but I ripped her fingers with red-painted nails from the sleeve and, without saying a word, walked to the cab stand. She remained standing on the platform, hands clasped in despair, looking at me with tearful eyes. You can't forgive traitors. Yeah, I guess her life with my majority didn't work out. Brothers, my parents had moved to a mansion outside of town. Stephen, who had graduated from the capital's technical university and was already vice president of my father's firm for economic relations, lived with them. I didn't go home for a few months. I stayed with a bachelor army friend. I applied to the Institute of Mechanical Engineering, arranged to live in a dormitory. I had no desire to meet my relatives, and even less with my brother. A month after my return, my grandfather found me. We drank tea with him for a long time in a small room in the dormitory. And then he unexpectedly offered me a job at the Combine as an auxiliary worker in the machine shop. What did you think? A director. I needed the money. The work schedule was flexible enough, so I accepted. I worked that way for almost 5 years. I met a pretty girl named Betty at a party, and after 6 months of courting, I got married. I didn't plan a big wedding on her, but on the day of the wedding, my parents came to our banquet with a table. Betty was shocked. She stared at my brother and me for a long time, marveling at our resemblance. My father gave us an apartment and a car for the wedding. My young wife was over the moon. She did a slow dance with my father and brother. And at the end of the evening, I happened to catch a lustful glimpse of my wife alone. A year later, we had a son out of happiness. I was as if in space. We lived with our relatives. Stephen stopped by to visit us a couple of times, but no creeping towards Betty on his part. I did not notice. 6 months ago, I successfully graduated from the institute, and my father appointed me deputy head of the marketing department. In my firm, I was directly subordinate to my brother. I started traveling, auditors, signing contracts. Everywhere Stephen put me. My wife was initially dissatisfied with my frequent absence, but then she got used to it. That's how we lived all this time. The car brought the hell back. I think I dozed off, took to the curb and pulled over, turned on the emergency lights, got out of the car, and did a few push-ups. Patted myself on the cheeks. It was early. I began to fall asleep still. Only the first hour smoothly moved from the place. The road, like a gray snake, wriggled under the wheels. Behind the next corner of the headlights illuminated a large black car pressed against the curb. I could clearly see a thin female silhouette desperately struggling between the two large black figures. Her chances of success were practically non-existent. The highway was empty at this time, and there would be no one to help her. I looked up at the sky. The torn disk of the moon was serenely casting a bright light on the road. Buttman was not visible, and they are not found in our area. Not many people scream in the night, caught in the clutches of a merciless predator. Alas, such is the prose of life. Tomorrow they'll find the corpse of a young girl in the roadside bushes. And I haven't slept. I haven't sobered up yet. After last night's drunkenness, the operative will swear to himself. But look, the scene will start a criminal case, which will never solve another grouse. After a while, the girl's body will get to the cemetery, and the file with the case will eventually settle in the archives. I got out of the car. Two big young men, dragging desperate highway patrolmen. A girl in a black SUV. She tried to scratch and bite, but a slap on the back of the SUV's right rear window was missing, and a light cigarette smoke was wafting from it. Finally, the guys rolled the woman up and carried her to the car. It was clear how this was all going to end. The thugs paid no attention to the blue Suzuki. Too small a bite could drive such a Kolimamaga. I headed leisurely toward the black car, hiding my baseball bat behind my back for the time being. And I was told it wouldn't come in handy. Oh yes, it is. The girl realized the situation had changed and started lashing out again. I got close to the participants in the crime drama. Apparently, in some subconscious way, the dashing fighters realized that the one who approached was not just a sucker. A beastly sense of danger had penetrated their uncluttered brains. "Let the girl go," I said firmly. As soon as the nearest thug tried to say something, I hit him in the face with a bat, without swinging. As Instructor Petrenko taught, there was a characteristic crunch and the opponent fell on his side. The second one let the girl out of his hands and rushed at me. He tilted his head like a bull. I took a step to the side and, with the knuckles of my fist, hit him in the temple. He collapsed on top of his coworker without a hitch. A car door slammed. A third character appeared, a pistol gleaming in the moonlight. I moved out of his line of sight, and in one leap I was next to him, tail on top of his Barrett, and pressed the magazine eject button. It was heard as it fell to the asphalt. At the same time, I turned on the safety flag. The subject, who had not raised anything, pressed the trigger time after time, but no shot was fired. I pulled the gun out of the poor guy's hands and, with a palm strike on the codex, knocked him out. I bent over and lifted the magazine. There was silence. The girl had disappeared. A red shoe and purse lay on the pavement. I pulled out my knife and carefully slashed all four tires. Sharp honed tans easily opened the rubber, once again inspected the battlefield, and headed to my car. Shoved the trophy pistol under the seat. Just a moment, and I was already driving on the highway again. After 500 meters, I saw a girl with a limp, walking briskly in my direction. She didn't even know to hide in the roadside bushes. I pulled up beside her. "Get in." I opened the right front door. She looked at me stunned. "Get in, don't be afraid." They drove off. She stood silently for a while, then hesitantly climbed into the front seat. "Here." I handed her a bag and a shoe like yours. She silently took her things and clutched them to her chest. She didn't look in my direction. "Where are you going?" I asked the right question. To my amazement, she named my city. I smiled and increased my speed. As we pulled in, I knew her story. The girl's name was Kathy. 20 years old, father gone, mother alcoholic. Last year, Kathy finished school and came to the capital. She didn't get into university, tried to find a job, but couldn't. A friend offered to earn money with her body. A pimp showed up. They took her passport and let her get away with it. She's been at it for over a year. So far, the young one's a success. Then they'll put her on drugs and sell her to an underground brothel. In 3 years, she'll die of an overdose. It's a short story, but it's so real. Knifeley was taken with a friend to a client tonight. He likes them young. The friend stayed, and she went home to the city I live in. Cab driver started harassing her, got his, and threw her out of the car. Then these three guys showed up in a black Lexus. I don't know how it would have ended if it wasn't for me. We got into town early in the morning. I dropped off my passenger at the address, a crumbling one-story cinder block barracks. I drove home. On the way, I stopped by a convenience store and bought a bouquet of flowers, candy, and a bottle of champagne. There was an unfamiliar car in my parking space. Strange. I went up to my floor and opened the door to my apartment. I walked into the kitchen, put the bottle on the table, and headed for the bedroom. Trying not to make any noise, I opened the door. They lay cuddled together like newlyweds. Betty laid her head on his hairy chest and sang sweetly. Ideal. Sleeping next to her was me, or rather, my other self, my twin brother. He hadn't even covered himself with a blanket, exposing his junk. I went back to the kitchen and opened the champagne, then went back into the bedroom and started pouring the sweetness of the privates. Betty woke up, and when she saw me, she rolled off the bed, scooting into the corner. Christopher, don't, I'm begging you. She didn't scream, she squealed. I'm breaking into a falsetto. Stephen, seeing me, smirked and without covering himself, got up and stretched. You're early. I grabbed his throat with one hand. I just had to squeeze his fingers, and that was it. You gonna kill me? My brother had a cocky smile on his face. She's been my woman for a long time. I'm just taking what's mine. I shifted my gaze to Betty. My wife grabbed her knees and went into a sobbing fit. I'm sorry, I'm sorry. Like an incantation, she repeated. I only love you. I wish I knew what such love was called. Then it hit me. You've been together a long time. I looked at Betty enough to give birth to a son for her, Stephen answered. I felt like I'd been hit over the head with a sledgehammer by a son. Daima, isn't that my son? I suddenly began to choke. Everyone knows that but you. Stephen laughed. Let me go. He threw my arm away. My punch to the jaw lifted his body off the floor. Stephen flew across the wide bed and collapsed, hitting his head on the wall. Only his bare feet were sticking out of the bed. Betty was already calling someone on his cell phone from his corner. Get over here as soon as you can. Christopher's here. My first instinct was to get out of here as fast as I could. I couldn't be in the same room with these assholes, with a wife who'd been having an affair behind my back for nearly 5 years, and Stephen the bastard. I couldn't call him a brother. I didn't want to get into the philosophy of family relationships. I just had itchy fists. I even became afraid that I would just kill her first, and then this thing that had taken over the body of my favorite woman. I went to the kitchen and poured a glass of vodka, which was in the refrigerator. I was going to drink it, but stopped and put the glass on the table. One should drink with joy, not with grief. Something told me I needed to stay sober, and this wouldn't be the last time. On this day, I was right. The front door slammed, and my parents came panting into the apartment. I sat in the kitchen and looked out the window, gathering what little strength I had left to calm myself down. My father came into the kitchen. Where's Stephen? What did you do to him? I expected all sorts of things, but not this kind of concern. Sebastian, Stephen is here. Mother's voice came from the bedroom. My father rushed into the bedroom, and there was a commotion. Apparently, they were bringing my wife's lover to his senses. I shook myself out of everything. I didn't care what happened next. I saw no sympathy for my father, only concern for the fate of his favorite son. He and my mother knew everything. Knowing full well about the bastard's connection to my wife, they knew about my son, knew and kept quiet, or worse, knew and supported him. I felt so disgusted I wanted to vomit. My machine began to calculate my next steps. The fact that my marriage was over was clear. The job was over too. I couldn't see that thing that used to be my brother every day. I had to move out of my apartment. It's a mess. Aside from my car, Betty quietly slipped into the kitchen. "Christopher, it's your brother." I couldn't resist. "You two look exactly alike." "Dimka, you're not a stranger's nephew either. You won't leave us." "Christopher, don't be silent." Betty grabbed my legs. "Do you want to beat me?" "Not at my place." I was so squeamish I got up and went to the window. The sun had already risen, and its rays were bouncing off my wind-up car parked right under the window. I was finally able to pull myself together. The true reasons for my long business trips became clear. While I was away from home, at the business of the firm only had a break with my wife. My parents came into the kitchen. "Christopher, don't make a tragedy out of what happened. We're one family, and we have to stick together. Dad started it. Don't make any rash decisions. I've already made my decision. I just have one question. You knew about everything. You knew the son wasn't mine." I spoke calmly, even casually. Not a muscle in my face quivered. The father was silent. Mother cried quietly. Everything was clear. "It's Stephen, my favorite son. How could you deprive him of another toy?" But Betty, why did she fall in love with me for money? Or did she fall in love so passionately that she decided to have another man's baby? Or just a woman's stupidity? I silently headed out into the hallway. My father tried to block my way. "You're not going anywhere." He grabbed my sleeve. "Take your hand away." He sensed something in my voice and quickly removed his hand. "I'm leaving. Don't try to contact me. You don't have a second son. I never had one. I'm filing for divorce today." I looked at Betty and the paternity suit. "Dimka has his own father. Let him raise him. He's your son. He loves you. You're not gonna leave him and me. I won't give you a divorce." Betty was hysterical. Dad slapped me on the cheek with the palm of his hand. "What are you talking about? Come to your senses. This is your wife and son." I grabbed him by the chest. The mother screamed. "Christopher, don't you dare. That's your father. If you touch me again, I'll beat you to it, you old bastard." I pushed my father away from my mother, grabbed my unopened bag, walked past the smirking Catholic standing in the bedroom doorway, and out onto the landing. "Christopher, don't go." Betty's hysterical scream was the last thing I heard before the door slammed shut. I was choking with rage. I stared blankly in front of me for a while. Then I started the engine and drove along the white lime-painted curb. Before my eyes stood a smirk, Stephen's whole face. With what pleasure I would have smeared his insolent face against the wall. But was it worth going to jail for? I guess not. I ended up alone with no wife, no son, no family, no job, and no place to live. Renewed, so to speak. What's up? I've got to find a place to live. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed the familiar number on the other end. It was answered very quickly. "Hello, it's the Elephant." I was driving the car with one hand and holding my cell phone in the other. "It's Christopher. I've got a minute." "Hello, Crank." To my army buddy, I was still Shatmanov. He was reluctant to call me by my first name. His habit used to annoy me a little. But now it's warmed my heart. I'm going to have to stay somewhere for a while again. I haven't decided whether to tell my friend about my troubles or not. I'm in trouble. I don't have a place to live yet. I see. The Elephant caught my thoughts on the fly. "Why don't you come to my place?" "There's a place here." Half an hour later, we were drinking fragrant tea in the kitchen. I categorically refused the offered food. After what I had been through, I couldn't eat a bite. My cell phone cried. Betty's name appeared on the screen. I disconnected the call. I had a fight with my wife. They'd poured me some hot tea. He asked with a wry grin. "It's much worse than that." I replied with a sigh. "Much worse." The Elephant fell silent, understandingly. He knew what worse meant. "Are you ready? We can go right now." My friend looked at the clock here, not far away in the private sector. Half an hour away. I didn't speed behind the Elephant's car. In fact, we hit a dirt road. And after 20 minutes, we pulled up to a small house standing in the back of a neglected lot. It's an inheritance from my grandmother, the elephant explained. I don't know what to do with it. I'm sorry to sell it, and I don't have time to work on it. So far I've set up a man's den here. Come in, elephant. He opened the lock on the gate and let me through, and a path barely visible in the grass led to the house. Well, look. The elephant opened the door hospitably. Live as long as you want. He approached the cast iron one standing almost in the middle. There is wood, and the stove heats up very quickly, a couple of piles. And it's Tashkent here. You can walk around in your underwear. It's not cold yet. The elephant opened the damper and looked inside the cast iron fireplace. Anyway, I have to go to work. And you get settled. If anything, call me. He went out. And after a while, I heard the sound of a car pulling away. I went to get my bag, took out my jeans and t-shirt, hung them on the back of a chair. Let them hang them. They didn't fit in the bag. I looked around curiously. Inside the house was clean and cozy. The cabin itself was made of basic logs, and there was a persistent aroma of Smolensk pine in the room. The walls were not stapled, but simply chicken scrubbed and covered with colorless varnish. This gave them a noble matte shade. The ceiling was uncomplicatedly stapled, meticulously worked planks. All the wooden parts were made on conscience. It was evident that the cabin was built capitally and for a long time. The few pieces of furniture were old and almost antique. A folding sofa covered with a motley oriental rug stood against a blank wall. By the window itself was roughly boarded up from throws and boards. The table in the corner hummed old. I remember another Khrushchev refrigerator, a Dnieper. At the opposite wall stood a dam and a cabinet from the times of the cult of personality. On the floor was a thick pallet, obviously handmade. On the thin carpet above the sofa hung several hunting knives, without sheaths, and an old rifle without a bolt, giving the whole place a hunter's charm. The sleepless night was taking its toll. I turned off my phone. Inundated with calls and texts from Betty, I covered myself with a blanket and fell asleep on the couch. When I woke up, it was almost dark. I tried to remember the slipped-away dream, but my brain refused to obey me. All that was left was the longing gnawing at my insides. I looked in the refrigerator. I see. It would be weird if there was anything in there. I pulled on jeans, a tank top, sneakers, and threw a camouflage jacket over my head, put on my favorite black baseball cap without a visor, locked the front door and headed for the car. It was already noticeably chilly. I closed the window and pressed the gas pedal. The car was rushing along the ring road. The torpedo slammed into the night air. I didn't know the neighborhood well and navigated by the glowing storefronts. The private sector was replaced by two-story barracks, built once for the workers of the furniture factory, some of which had lighted windows. At the end of the street, I saw the green window of a grocery store. I lurked with alcohol, took a couple of bottles of Dagestan brandy, 2 packs of dumplings, a couple of cans of dry potatoes, cucumbers, bread and some canned fish, and 2 dozen eggs. It seems to be enough for the first time. But how long would it last? This first time, I had no idea. At the checkout, I held out my card sleepily. The burly aunt swiped it several times on the terminal and looked at me disappointedly. "Access to the card is blocked," in a strained voice, she said. "Don't worry, I'll pay in cash." I held out the money, picked up the bags, and walked to the car. It made sense. Pops blocked my cards. What a bitch. I mean, it was my honestly earned money, my barely used paycheck. Good thing I cashed out almost half of it. I pulled my cell phone out of my pocket. Shit, I turned it off when the screen lit up again. A barrage of messages and missed calls rained down on me. Without reading, I deleted the garbage and drove home. To turn around, I had to drive to the end of the alley to the intersection. I had already turned left when my attention was caught by a commotion near the archway leading into the courtyard of a 2-story barracks. Against the wall of the house, 6 in a pile, stood a few stripped, frustrated girls and watched tensely as 2 guys methodically beat their nearly stripped colleague. One of them was holding the unfortunate prostitute by the hair, winding it around his arm for convenience. I rolled down the right window. The execution took place in silence. The guys were engaged in their usual business, bringing up their ward. The girl did not resist and obediently bore rather strong blows. She only moaned pitifully. She did not even try to escape from her tormentors. It's understandable. Occupational hazard. Pimps educate the contingent to interfere. The girl was no longer on her feet and collapsed under the lantern. For a moment, her bloody face was in the light. Her producers did not stop beating her. Only instead of using their fists, they started kicking. The victim was no longer moaning, but wheezing. Her face looked familiar. That's right. That's my nocturnal knocker. An associate, in fact. And scouts don't leave their own behind. I jumped out of the car with a baseball bat. "Hey, stop hitting her," I shouted, rapidly approaching the place of execution. One of the managers turned around, showing me his face. This is what I was waiting for. The impact crunch and thud of a fallen body. The second character reacted instantly and rushed into the back alley. But my rage was looking for an outlet, and I caught up with him in 2 jumps and hit him on the spine with the bat. The pimp collapsed under the leather. Such a blow makes the legs fail. The fallen man lay on the asphalt, drooling bloody drool and with taut lower limbs. I looked around. No help was needed. I carefully picked up the lying maiden and gently placed her on my shoulder, carried her, and put her in the car. She only looked at me with eyes frozen in a mute scream and moaned quietly. I turned around and drove home, avoiding the potholes. Kathy was lying on the couch, and I cut off her rags with a knife. When I saw the naked body, I shuddered involuntarily. There was one big bruise on her stomach. Her legs are bruised, and there are cuts on the inside of her thighs and epoch marks from extinguished cigarettes. His face is broken and swollen. What kind of brute would you have to be to abuse a woman like that? I gingerly felt her limbs and ribs. The girl was moaning normally. Looks like the bones are intact. But I'd already realized I couldn't do it. We can't take her to the hospital. Labila. She'll call the police right away. I dialed the elephant's number. Half an hour later, he arrived with a bearded man. Sam. A doctor. He introduced himself. Where's the body? That's his humor. The doctor gave her an anesthetic shot. Peroxide washed her wounds, bandaged her up. She's lucky. Her bones are intact, but she's in bad shape. This is a knife. He handed me a red packet. Give me 2 pills every 600 hours. Don't worry, your friend will pull through. I shook his hand and looked questioningly at the elephant. A molder. He caught my eye. I don't need anything. Robert has already paid me back. The elephant patted me on the shoulder, and he and the doctor left, and I moved the chair closer to the girl lying there and poured myself a glass of cognac. When I was a kid, I loved riding the railroad. I liked to look out the window, especially when the train was at the station. The station was always on the right as the train traveled, and on the left was the oncoming track. When a train was hitting it, it gave the impression that our train was moving and the oncoming train was standing. But once you looked to the right, the illusion of movement was gone. It reminded me of my family life. I kept looking to the left, mistaking the illusion of motion for truth. But in reality, my train was standing still, and in my so-called happiness, I never bothered to look to the right. It was only now that I began to realize that the situation was quite satisfactory and that she was losing face next to me on the pillow. One and the same. The rest was just a romantic adventure. The wife knew exactly what she was doing. She knew perfectly well that the baby would look like me anyway, so she gave herself to my brother with enthusiasm, with all her body and soul. At the same time, piously believing in family values, diligently imitating with me numerous orgasms, so that I did not suspect anything. My parents knew everything from the beginning. They were quite happy with the situation. Grandson, in any case, they're all the more from their favorite son of the hair, and I would be quite content with scraps from the bar's table. From the point of view of my parents and Betty, Nothing egregious happened. A little embarrassment the horny husband found out, but he'll get over it and return to the family. We just have to wait. And they waited, blocking all my payment cards, thus leaving me without money, regularly sending a message and calling Betty. The content was familiar. I love you, I'm sorry, we'll have another son of yours. Then her mother joined her. It was trying to shame and push pity. It was hard to manipulate me. I cut them out of my life completely, cut off all ties. If they all, including not my son, fell through the ground, I would just shrug my shoulders and breathe a sigh of relief at being rid of those things. I didn't hesitate to file for divorce. Along with the paternity suit, the court ordered a genetic evaluation. No matter how much my family protested, calling me paranoid and scum. Bottom line, I'm not the father. You should have seen their disappointed faces. I wonder what they were hoping for. Then there was the trial. It was November and the frost was gripping my cheeks. We arrived at the hearing with an elephant. He had been patronizing me lately, trying to always be there for me. All these judicial adventures have simply got to me. The judge listened attentively to all the streams of lies and dirt that my former relatives diligently poured on me. When Stephen was given the floor, she perked up. A semblance of a smile appeared on her face. She kept shifting her gaze from him to me. The family's lawyer was jumping out of his pants in his closing argument, blaming me for everything that had happened. Then I was given the floor. I didn't hire a lawyer. I didn't want anything from them. I left everything. The former apartment, the car, left my father's company, and did not claim the inheritance. I didn't know my grandfather's position. He was abroad all this time and did not seem to be interested in family problems. Finally, the judge announced the decision: divorce. No alimony for either son or wife. I am not the father. The judge also advised me to sue the father's company for severance pay from my earnings for the last month of employment. At this, she gave a very expressive look to my father, who even folded under her gaze. Hammer blow. And the elephant and I headed out. My car was parked in a parking lot about 500 meters from the courthouse. On the way, the elephant ran to the store to buy some brandy to celebrate his freedom. I was taking my time walking to the car when I heard it over my ear. Satisfied bastard. A hard blow from behind knocked me off my feet, and I fell forward, barely able to put my hands in front of me. I didn't realize what had happened. The toe of a shoe slammed into my face. My eyes went black, and I fell on my back. Stephen was leaning over me. Next time, I'll kill you. He almost screamed as my father ran to pull him away from me, but my ex-brother managed to kick me in the side with his shoe. Betty came running toward me screaming. She knelt down and tried to lift my head to stop the blood coming out of my nose. Honey, are you hurt? I almost threw up at those words, and I quickly pulled myself together. It took me a second to get to my feet. I pushed away Betty, who had become a stranger, and turned to your brother out of the corner of my eye. I saw an elephant running across the street toward me. There was a crowd around us. Yeah, a lot of people were taking pictures on their phones. Stephen broke free from my father's grasp and lunged at me. That was his mistake. I met him with the back of my hand to his forehead. He froze for a moment, then collapsed like a Leatherman at my feet. I didn't finish him off. Somebody in the crowd clapped. A police car pulled onto the lawn. They're right on time, as always. I'm on my way to the station in handcuffs. Stephen came to his senses and filed a report against me for brutal, gratuitous beating. All the family, except Betty and my ex-mother, confirmed it. But then the elephant appeared on the scene with the cell phone footage. Everything fell into place. I was swayed and offered to file a report on Stephen. But I spit under my feet and, accompanied by the elephant, went out. How did the tour of the station end for my ex-family? I don't know. The only thing I remember was my mother crying, frozen with terror in her eyes. Was she starting to get it? Toward midnight, the cold began to make itself felt. It brazenly crept under the plate, or the hall of my bare heels with a cold tongue. I looked at the couch. The girl was sleeping quietly in a dream. I carefully adjusted the blanket, crawled down. Went outside. The full moon brightly illuminated the yard, then green color. I threw a few small ones on the curve of my arm. Polish Shuck added a couple of cracklings for the stack and went back into the cabin. A few minutes later, the stove hummed. Nodding burning wood and filling the room with the smell of smoke, it immediately became cozy and warmer. I took cognac out of the refrigerator and poured myself another half glass. Immediately, I wanted to sleep. I sat down in an armchair and detached myself from the reality of where I was. I was awakened by Kathy's loud cry. "Don't worry, you're at a friend's house." I tried my best to calm the girl down. She flinched at my voice and tried to tuck her legs in. I guess she involuntarily caused the pain because she moaned loudly. She looked at me and tried to remember where she knew me from. "I gave you a ride into town last night. My name is Christopher. I met you. Remember, I spoke softly so I wouldn't scare her," and where she was afraid to phrase her question. "Your friends, they're gone and hopefully never will be again. You need to lie down for a while, and then you can leave if you want to." I handed her a leg. "Take a pill." Kathy looked at me. She looked like she was expecting another one of life's tricks, now in my face. "How did I get here?" "I brought you here. I'm kind of in charge of you now. Don't worry, just accept it. It's hard for me to explain the obvious to you." I smiled. "You hungry?" I put a skillet on the stove, and soon the room smelled of food. Kathy ate quickly, as if she was afraid I would take it away from her. I made tea from the elephant supply, and having judged it beforehand, handed the cup to the girl. Then I helped her to the bathroom and made her comfortable on the couch again, covered her with a blanket. Soon she fell asleep. In the evening, the elephant came and dropped off the groceries, reported the situation. "No one is quiet in the city." I ran it through the guys. "No one is looking for her." He nodded at the sleeping Kathy. A week later, Kathy started getting up, and after another 5 days, hiding her eyes, she asked if I could leave. "Sure. No one's keeping you. Can you go right now?" I turned away and continued peeling potatoes. I had a craving for fried potatoes, so I'll cook for myself and the elephant. I didn't care if the girl stayed or not. I'd say her leaving took away a lot of problems, so good riddance. Kathy stood in the middle of the room, covered with a sheet and holding the remains of her dress. I rummaged through my bag and pulled out my tracksuit. "Take it." "Day, can you take my jacket?" "Wait." I rummaged through my closet. On the bottom shelf were some old women's shoes. "Maybe they'll fit." I put them in my clothes, and immediately I looked like a retired warrant officer. "Do you want me to drive you or call a cab?" "Better a cab." And ours waved. "Thank you." The cab came quickly. I didn't go to see Kathy off. She's not a little girl. It's hard to get a man out of shit, especially if they don't want to. Prostitutes come in many ways, not always forced. It's not my problem to raise her. You helped me out. You can't save everyone from here on out. A week after the divorce, my cards came back on. I got my last month's pay and severance pay. I was having more fun, but it couldn't last. I had to find a job at my father's company. The way was closed to me, as well as to other production facilities in our city. I tried several times to inquire about a job, but as soon as I heard my name, the personnel officers fell into a stupor and shut up, making it clear that the conversation was over. Only one manager of a small factory, smiling affectionately, advised to turn to Dr. Sebastian, I mean my father, and with him to solve the problem of employment. Anyway, my ex-family had me in a tight squeeze. In the end, the elephant managed to get me a job at a small car repair shop on a small salary. Its owner was too low-flying and didn't fall within the circle of interest of my ex-brother and his daddy. I didn't make any plans yet and was going to spend the winter at the elephant's house, and in the spring I was going to go to the east of the country in search of work. One late afternoon there was a timid knock at the door. I looked at the wall clock. The first hour was a little late. Outside the door was her life from the cold. "Kathy." "May I come in?" "Come in." I shivered. The girl held a bag and was wearing my camouflage jacket. She walked to the stove and held out her Asian palms. "How's business? How's business?" I said ironically. "I'd like some tea." I handed her an aluminum mug, fresh over emergency almost black tea. Kathy drank the tea, trying not to look in my direction. There was a pause. "Christopher, I might as well stay." She sighed heavily. "What's wrong? You have a room, don't you?" I put a candy bar in front of the guests and moved a stool. "A neighbor has taken the room as a coffee table. He'll give it back if I get into bed with him. He says I'm not worthless. I've been living with a friend all this time. She's getting married, so she kicked me out." The girl looked at the fire in the stove. "I have nowhere to go. The only thing left for me to do is to throw myself in the noose." Tears came out of her eyes. "So you're talking about the rope?" I grinned. She looked at me with a look that made me choke on my laughter. It was clear. "You can stay. Except I have one room and a couch." "One? You're against the wall. I'm on the edge. I'm spreading my arms. We'll figure something out later." In the morning, the elephant arrived. He wasn't surprised to see Kathy. "Let's go and talk." He went out to the yard first. "There's a job, but it pays well. It's a long way to Siberia. Today we have to meet the customer." Preliminarily, I was told that the work will be on the Army specialty. The elephant shook his lips. "A hot spot, huh? Dealing with corrupt politicians." I was disappointed. "It looks like something else. We'll see on the spot." The elephant grinned. "We can always say no. Where do we meet? At the Troika restaurant. They'll come to us." The elephant went to the car. "Get in. Let's go." I went back for my jacket. I nodded to Kathy and followed the elephant. In a restaurant with a dubious reputation. There weren't many people at this time. A couple of people at the window were getting healthy. And me and the elephant. After a while, a man came to our table and, without asking permission, sat down across from us. His whole appearance emphasized solidity, and at the same time he resembled a cobra preparing a goose for a throw. Ex-military, a special forces man, perhaps. Invisible vibes of danger mixed with the scent of expensive perfume. Fog, sharks, or our table completed the image. Stylish gray suit with a small checkered pattern, worn over a blue shirt with no tie. An insanely expensive Swiss watch and a platinum ring. On the ring finger of his left hand, exactly the kind of ring a confident man should wear, a successful man. "My name is Robert," he began without preamble. "I take it this is the man you were talking about." The elephant nodded. "Let's get right to the point. Do you know who I represent? The master is getting married." At that, our interlocutor smiled and is about to retire, handing over his business to his daughter. He recalled her from London and began to familiarize her with the business. For this purpose, he sent her to eastern Siberia to the gold mines. Nellie flew safely to the place, settled in a hotel, and disappeared. She didn't contact him for a week. Naturally, the owner got worried. We'd managed to find out that Nellie was kidnapped by local scumbags, not for ransom, but mainly for sexual pleasures. He's holding her in the taiga at a ranch. We know the place. Robert ran his hand over his face as if to relieve fatigue. We need to get her back. We've got to clean everybody out first. You know what I mean. Unfortunately, we don't have specialists of your caliber. Is that why I'm here? What's the price? The elephant has spoken. $5,000 each now and 10 after the issue is resolved. 20. And you can do whatever you want with us. In the words of a movie character, the elephant replied, "Agreed." The man nodded. "When do we leave?" Elephant took a sip of coffee that had already cooled down. "Yesterday, do not take anything with you. You will get everything on the spot. You'll be met and given a guide. Here's the money." Robert looked at me too closely and pushed 2 envelopes in our direction. "A car will pick you up in 2 o'clock. He stood up and, without saying goodbye, headed for the exit. He was quickly followed by two drunkards sitting by the window. "We're going away for a while. You'll stay in charge." Kathy shuddered. "Do you drive a car?" She nodded. I put the keys on the stool. "Take mine. They're gonna ask about us. If they do, you don't know anything. They just disappeared, that's all." I instructed my apartment. "I'll leave you the money." I put 1,000 Baku rubles next to the keys. "That'll be enough until we get back. But I have to go." I picked up my bag and headed for the door. "Christopher, wait." The girl came right up to me. "You just come back. You hear? Please come back." She threw her arms around me and snuggled into me for a second. I could taste the kiss on her lips. In her eyes, I could see more than just the sadness of parting. It all happened very quickly. I came to my senses when she made me see her off like that for the first time in my life. We got there without adventure. From the airport, we were taken to a local club. Misleadingly referred to as a hotel, we dropped our bags and went for shells. Robert wasn't lying. We were picked up winter camouflage, white robes, wide Taiga skis. We took 2 Kalashnikov assault rifles with a silencer, a Stetkin pistol, a couple of tactical backpacks, complete with an unloader, winter boots, gloves. In general, everything that could come in handy in the Taiga. In violation of the instructions, I even managed to run through the local market from Samalki. I bought an antique stiletto for a ridiculous amount of money. In disgraced camouflage torn jeans, a perfect weapon in close combat. What brings him to this neck of the woods? Hard to imagine. We managed to sleep for 3 hours. How? A protective colored UAZ truck came to pick us up. We drove about 160 kilometers. Then we turned onto a country road. After 30 kilometers, the car stopped on its own. The driver helped us take things out of the trunk, turned the UAZ and left the Taiga on skis. A man in a warm jacket with a rifle over his shoulder came out. "This man, your guide." He introduced himself. I nodded. The elephant and I jumped around a bit. Our shell made no noise. We skied and followed each other with the guide away from the road into the thicket. The night was frosty. Already habitually fastened skis, we trampled a track along the snowfield in the Taiga. There was a ringing silence. It was as if she was asleep. It was covered with icicles and hoarfrost. In the clear night sky hung a full green-blue moon, illuminating the forest. So clearly each tree stood out, and the number of stars was innumerable. You could pick needles. We had been walking for many hours through these wild places, carefully avoiding the trampled paths of hunters. If my heart were calmer, I could blissfully admire the beauty of the night. But my knees were dying from fatigue, and sticky, salty sweat was pouring down my face. I took a gulp of saliva, fixed my backpack, pulled the belt of my automatic rifle, and continued on my way, trying not to lose the back of the guide in the darkness. Gathering on the road, the elephant and I took with us only the essentials, some dry rations, matches, and a few horns with ammunition. On my belt, I had a tactical knife stiletto, bought recently at the flea market. I strapped it to my right hip. Its camouflage, torn sheath blended in with the color of my pants. It was almost impossible to see it there. It's a great thing for people who understand. We're supposed to reach our target just before dawn. Well, calculations are calculations, and we had to walk by panic of my wife, snow-covered virgin, and fatigue by the middle of the night had already piled up a lot. And at dawn, there is still the main work to be done. Having thrown us in these hours to stop is impossible. We got into the rhythm of movement, and any stop could throw off the breath and relax. It's a pleasure to stomp through the Taiga at night. God forbid you move your leg or break anything. You can't get out of the Taiga by yourself. How many people died like that, went into the Taiga, and never came back? I rhythmically moved my feet, helping myself with sticks, trying to breathe in time with the movement. The terrain was mostly flat, though a few times I had to roll down some low slides. But that was all right. We should be there soon. And by my calculations, it wasn't far now. Suddenly, I felt someone's unkind gaze on me. I even flinched. He's not slowing down. I looked around. No one. Was it just me? Unused to trusting my senses, or should I say instinct? That animal, subconscious sense of impending danger. It's never failed me in war or in everyday life. So there is something or someone here. I turned around. The elephant was methodically swinging his ski poles and following me along the trampled track. I wondered what I had imagined. Maybe it was a rogue bear. I didn't want it on my head. I switched to light running, trying to keep a close eye on the road and the sides, just in case I took the safety off the automatic rifle. The cartridge was in the cartridge, so in case of what there is something to meet. Suddenly, the guide stopped and raised his hand. I cautiously drove up and stopped beside him. "There is someone here," the alien hunter said quietly. "He's watching us. Should we attack or something?" I was breathing hard. I was tired of civilian life. I don't know. If he wanted to, he would have attacked us long ago. I smelled him 200 hours ago. He's coming from our right about 100 meters away. I cautiously looked in that direction, but I didn't see anything. I looked back and looked at the elephant crouching with the machine gun. "What are we going to do?" quietly asked the guide. "Do the job." I looked expressively at the machine. "Let's go." It was time to show the hut, but there was a forest all around, and there was no sign of habitation. Suddenly, it seemed to me that the frightened guide had lost his way, but he stopped and waved to me. "It's gonna be the edge. We're at the target. You're on your own from here. You got a map. You'll reach the point on your own." The guide turned his skis around. "Good luck. Aren't you afraid?" "Alone. I've been in the Tavas since I was a kid." The man shrugged his shoulders and, without looking back, walked along the trampled track in the opposite direction. Soon his back, illuminating mine with moonlight, disappeared behind the trees. In about an hour it should be dawn, but the moon seemed to shine even brighter. For our expedition, such weather is worse than the worst enemy. I'd rather have fog and snow, but such was our luck. "The elephant has arrived." "Well, Commander, we start quietly," he said and adjusted the belt of the machine gun. We slid toward the lodge, hiding in the shadows of the trees, trying to keep Luna to our left so that our shadows merged with the solid wall of the forest. At last I saw at the opposite edge of the clearing Belevskaya in the moonlight a long structure enclosed by a fence of reflex sheets-based iron. The two windows facing the edge of the forest, where the elephant and I lurked, were dark. Almost closely adjoining the house was a barn made of logs, and farther away in a special area, barely covered with snow, was dark. The historical monster of thunder was a helicopter, sabers, blades. On the side opposite the house, there were several tanks, probably with fuel for the helicopter. Somewhere nearby an engine clattered, generating electricity. At the entrance to the lodge it dimmed. An uneven blue-colored flashlight came running. I pulled my night binoculars out of my unloading and brought them up to my eyes. There didn't seem to be any dogs. We started off as if we were on a roll. I felt a familiar shiver run down my spine. The feeling of the last seconds before the attack, when it is impossible to stop, as it is impossible to stop a snow avalanche that has begun its movement. Without turning his head, he waved his hand, and in perfect silence, the figure in a white coat zigzagged towards the fence. In a few seconds, the elephant was already on the other side and took up a position at the side wall, holding the entrance in his sights. I overcame the obstacles in one leap and stood close to the door, put my palm on the handle, and gently pulled the door towards me. It moved towards me and stopped, as if it was bumped into something. I see, with the usual hook, holding the automatic behind my left hand with my right. I pulled out a knife and slipped the blade into the slot. Lightly pressed upward, pulled at the door toward me, and slowly lowered the hook so it wouldn't yank open. Carefully, he opened the door. Silence from the cabin smelled of lodging, onions, stew, gun grease. Behind me, an elephant crept through the doorway. Just in case of fear and neon tiptoe, I slipped inside, moving quickly and silently, putting soul by soul, judging by the life-affirming ramp up to the wearer. Nausea from behind a closed door leading to a side room. 2 natives were sound asleep. I slid like a shadow along the wall without taking my finger off the trigger. Where is the third? And the prisoner? As if answering my mute question from behind the other door, I heard a characteristic slapping and a loud, prolonged groan. I gently pushed the door open and peered through the crack. A big male was grooming a woman on all fours. Well done. With such fervor that she occasionally hit her head on the headboard of the bed. Good thing there was a mat hanging there. Softened the blows I could clearly see in the darkness, rhythmically moving white in the ass of the man. There was an example of the most tender intergender friendship inherent in a partner who understood each other well. It didn't look like the damsel from To Her Beau. Not willingly, I let him live for a second, and then I pulled out, stellet, and put it to the hilt between the ribs, right in the heart through my body. Like a discharge of electric current ran inexpressible sensation, transmitting itself to the enemy along with the impact of the knife. The moment when the man you killed leaves the life, and it's as if you see his flying soul. I felt like an angel of death for a moment. The male silently fell face down on the maiden. She had already opened her mouth to scream, but I had time to put my glove in it. The maiden fell silent, spinning her eyes frantically. Behind my back, the elephant's automaton clicked softly twice. For a moment about the light in the corridor, not bright flashes. 2 bodies returned to the beds and froze, convulsing, clearly emphasizing the feet in a fading rhythm. Illuminated by the full moon, the Tega froze in a light stupor in the silvery moonlight. Dimly cast white coats, tall pines. I pressed the 2 tangent 3 times. The radio station quietly took a chance. The signal was received. Half an hour later, I heard the approaching rumble of a helicopter. The elephant had pulled onto the porch, a bound maiden. She was lunging, trying to say something and trying with all her might to spit out my glove sticking out of her mouth. Maybe he'll untie her, the hardy elephant said doubtfully. So that she bites us no more, or what? We'll turn her in, Daddy. Let her deal with it. We've done our job. I and the elephant picked up the girl under the arms and dragged to what helicopter. The pilot keeps the engine running, and the propeller blades revolved, raising a blizzard of snow. Take it, I shouted to the chief of security, standing on the top step of the gangway. He stretched out his hand and pulled the girl inside the car. I put the machine gun behind my back and started to climb up the ramp. Robert shouted something from behind my back, and a shot rang out very loudly. I was hit in the shoulders with a sledgehammer, and the light went out. Consciousness came back in pieces. First I felt my legs, then my arms, then a piercing cold. When I lifted my eyelids, a blinding white light, bright and sharp as an awl, struck my eyes. I blinked a few times. I could see nothing. Recent events pulled out of memory: Zamka girl, a helicopter, and a shot in the back, something behind the rustle and the side. Are you awake? The elephant had no choice of words as usual. What was that? I spoke slowly. I wasn't fully awake yet. It was a cleanup job. First us, and then us. The elephant spit. Honestly, I don't understand it myself. Who did the shooting? There's one thing that's been bothering me so far. Yeah, our guide was buried in a snowdrift, waiting for a command. He hit your backpack, and there's a titanium plate in there. If you need anything. Elephant wiped his face with the palm of his hand. You got thrown off the ramp, and you're like this. While he was shooting at you, I cut him off with my machine gun. Too bad, I missed the bastard large enough. He managed to run over the door. The elephant smiled, but I'll get him too. I lay there, afraid to move. The pain in my back throbbed and jolted by the metal butt of the machine gun. It pressed painfully on my ribs. The assault rifle ended up under my stomach. Slowly, the ability to think returned. True, there were not much thoughts in my head. Everything was clear. We were screwed. And it had been planned from the beginning. But now the main question in my mind was how to get out of here. How long had I been unconscious? I turned on my side and tried to pull out the machine gun for about half an hour. The elephant tried to help me, and the chopper flew right away. Almost immediately made a circle and went northeast. Right. Flew to Hutton. I finally got my gun out. We gotta get out of here as fast as we can. As if they heard my words in the distance, a wolf howl, long and dreary. The forest sanitation workers are coming, the elephant snorted. I did not share his amusement. Nonsense. If anything, I've stayed at the camp. The walls are strong there. The elephant said cheerfully. I don't think so. They'll come back, especially since they know you're alive. Why do they need witnesses? I was going for the worst-case scenario. Out of the woods, there was the growing rumble of a helicopter engine. Above the tops of the pine trees, the wing propeller and the machine appeared. The helicopter swept over the clearing and went for a second circle. In white coats, we were invisible from above, and it inspired hope. The helicopter showed itself again, and I saw a rocket break off from its console and rush downward, leaving a blue trail behind it. It hit right in the middle of the cabin. There was a burst of flame, and then an explosion. We were covered in heat and hit by a blast wave. As if on cue, we dropped our heads into the snow as we came to our senses. The rumble of the helicopter came from far away. Well, everything was finally cleaned up. I looked toward the cabin. The cabin was burning. Clouds of blue smoke were rising above the taiga. A little later, the fuel tanks burst. Those bitches. The elephant cursed. Yes, they were competently. All the more reason to do so. After waiting about 10 minutes and making sure the helicopter was finally gone, I got to my feet. I shook myself out of a decent amount of snow. Get up. Let's see if there's anything left. I hung the automatic rifle on my chest and headed towards the bush. Slightly afraid, putting the machine gun in front of me, I walked towards the huge campfire. A head still heavy. Forest, trees, fears, howling. Snow dust was pulled by the sharp smell of burning. Inflamed wood resin, rubber, something else rather synthetic. Ahead of them lay a few dead trees. The heat of the fire hit me in the face. At the sight of the winter house, a heap of burning logs, a rubble fence. I walked another 50 meters, gradually slowing my step. I couldn't get closer. I could not let the heat from the fire. The fire was still blazing in full force. I stopped next to it. The elephant was breathing heavily. The situation was changing like in a kaleidoscope of actions of our enemies. And these are definitely enemies impossible to guess. It would be good if they thought we were dead. But who can predict what the enemy is thinking? What do we do? The elephant, the life-loving one, has spoken. We have to go. I pulled out a map. The nearest village is 80 kilometers away. It'll take 2 days to ski across the virgin land. And we have water all around us. I pointed to the snow. But what about the wolves? Suddenly, I felt the prickly stare again. My heart treacherously fluttered. Again, we seemed to be being watched. I looked at the elephant. Don't you feel anything? My partner lifted his chin. As if there was something in the air uncertainly, he muttered. We need to find the skis. I turned my head. And suddenly I saw what I should have seen immediately. About 150 meters away from the fire, a small helicopter stood by the forest itself. Of course, it could have been destroyed by the explosion, but it's worth a try. It's a sin not to take such a chance, especially the only one. I turned to the elephant, but he was staring at something on the opposite side of the glade. Look, he said in a breathy voice. I put the binoculars to my eyes. At the very edge of the forest, without hiding, there stood a lone figure, resembling a human, exactly resembling a pair of neck with black hair, moving on 2 legs. It walked slowly in our direction. Instead of a human head, she had the head of a bear on her shoulders, or something like that. The beast walked slowly toward us, as if it realized we had nowhere to go. A cold dread began to creep into my soul. My legs felt like absorbent cotton, and a foreign voice sounded in my head. There's nowhere to go. There was only death ahead. I looked at the elephant, who was silently staring at the approaching monster. Saliva was coming out of his half-open mouth. He's a degenerate. From this thought, I came to my senses, grabbed my partner by the collar of his jacket, and dragged him to the helicopter. The helicopter was intact. I saw it from a distance. What happened next was a poker game. Is there fuel in the tank? If so, how much? I kicked the elephant inside and climbed in myself. The elephant came to his senses and looked at me with a meaningful look. He said, "We need a silencer now," and pulled the bolt. Too bad the caliber is too small. Well, sorry, no grenade launcher. I've been tinkering with the dashboard. I've never seen a helicopter like this before, but all machines like this have the same controls. Give me the ignition key and I'll need one. I took a quick look at the instruments, everything familiar. All in all, no surprises, some things I've never seen before. On this model I have not practiced, but all the improvements of the third degree, reading a prayer to myself, reached for the right ones. The toggle switch started the engine, the twin screws with the glowing gunpowder spinning at idle. Need to extend it at least a little. Looked at the fuel gauge. Looks like there's half a tank. Increased the revs, and the engine started howling and buckled up. I yelled to the elephant. At that moment, right in front of my face came a glowing face. It was a strange, incredible creature. Most of all, it looked like a monster from my nightmarish dreams. It resembled half bear, half monkey with a large head remotely resembling a bear's. It was covered from its huge, angular head to its heels with gray-black fur that was not long, thick, and dense. At the open mouth, wetly knotted self and pianist saliva. Dense rows of even sharp-pointed fangs. In the short fur solidly cover the muzzle under the wary standing triangular ears. Burning with inhuman malice. Deep-set scarlet eyes with vertically set yellow badges. Its roar was audible even in the cockpit, despite the engine running. I lifted the car into the air. The helicopter pecked a few times. Nodes wobbled, but obediently gained altitude. I looked down. The creatures were raging there, having lost their prey. I raised the helicopter another 5 meters, added Gaza, and headed northwest towards the village of Razdolnoy. "And how long have you been flying helicopters?" Slan gave a voice. "You won't believe it, I'm flying for the first time." The man put his elbows on the table and looked attentively at his interlocutor. "I ask you again, Sebastian, where is Christopher?" Sebastian felt like he was being interrogated. He felt as if his father could see right through him. "Dad, I haven't seen him in a long time. Right after the divorce, he disappeared." "Disappeared? Did you go looking for him?" The owner of one of the largest steel companies in the country shook his head incredulously. Why did they divorce? Christopher, for some reason, decided that Stephen had slept with his wife. So he made a scandal of it. Sebastian looked uncertainly at his youngest son. For some reason, he decided out of the blue. John grinned, but his grin was cold. And then he got divorced and disappeared. There must be a good reason for a man to go to such drastic measures. I know my grandson. He doesn't make too hasty decisions. Grandfather grumbled. "John, you mustn't worry." The young woman standing behind the chair put a hand on the man's shoulder. Grandfather affectionately covered her palm with his, instantly drawing a disgruntled grimace from his son. "All right, it's all clear to me. Sit in the hallway." Grandfather turned to the young man frozen at the window and said, "Call my daughter-in-law." A still quite young woman entered the office. She walked uncertainly to the long desk. "Hello, Emily. Have a seat. Would you like some tea or coffee? Have you had any breakfast today?" The old man's eyes shone with love. It was clear that he loved his daughter-in-law and showed her no ostentatious respect. "Hello, Daddy." Emily looked warily at Emily's father-in-law. "What's wrong?" "While I was away." "Why did Christopher leave the family?" Emily cried. "He accused Betty of adultery and of having a son by another man." "Why did he think that?" Grandfather frowned. "He caught Betty's table in bed." Emily covered her face with her hands. beat up Stephen and left. Beaten up by Stephen, also fabulously lucky. I would have killed standing behind the chair. The woman soothingly stroked her grandfather's shoulder. Where can Christopher be now? He was at the trial with his army friend. His name is Elephant, I think. Maybe he's at his place now. The old man hesitated. Camille ordered. He raised his head and looked at the young woman. It will be done, John. She wrote something down in a notebook. Emily. Grandpa smiled. I'll take you to the restaurant for lunch and we'll talk. He got up from his chair, showing that the formal part was over. In my time, I took everything from the Army service, even the ability to drive a helicopter. It may have been a little tricky, but it was the skill that saved our lives today. Down below was a solid, blurry green-white mass. The weather began to deteriorate from above. Sullen gray clouds loomed overhead. I made a slight turn, touched the wheel. The helicopter tilted. It seemed that the gray sky dropped lower, threatening to pin the car to the ground. I put on my headphones and turned on the onboard radio. Nothing could be heard in the headphones but a crackling noise. The helicopter shook. An air pocket. Heart froze for a moment. Fell into my stomach. Nearby, an elephant was swearing. A jolt began, but soon stopped. I estimated that we had already flown most of the distance to our target. I looked at the gauges. We were almost out of fuel. We'd have to land soon. I looked down. A sea of green pine needles. Ahead showed mountains shrouded in snow and horns on the slopes and trees. I took the car higher. The haze around me was thickening, but I had to climb up far beyond all the instruments. I knew how to use them. It wasn't about finesse. You fly. You don't fall down, that's fine. I think I've had enough of climbing above the clouds. I switched back to horizontal flight. The helicopter shook. Squeezing the levers, I leveled the machine. We were on the same course. I was absorbed in maneuvering. Practically did not look at the instrument panel. I still didn't understand the position of some of the arrows of some instruments. The helicopter was flying over the Green Taiga again. A gray thread of the frozen wide Svura River with a compass flashed where white patches of birch trees broke through. I realized that I had not so much deviated from the intended course in 10 West no more. I wiped my face wet with sweat with the sleeve of my robe mask, and a red light on the dashboard was freezing, indicating that the fuel was left for 10 minutes. I began to descend, looking for a place to land. The Taiga was a solid dark green carpet. Finally, I saw the white one about Galena. I made a circle and came in, started manipulating the levers again. The helicopter lay there. Every now and then it fell into weightlessness. Finally, the machine went down responsibly. The landing was not very soft. The helicopter perceptibly bumped the angry ground. The rotating blades raised around a small snowstorm. Finally, the engine shut down and there was silence. I pulled out the map and tried to determine our location to Razdolnoy. It was about 20 kilometers, but we had to walk them even without skis. We crawled out of the cabin and looked. The river was somewhere on the right, about 2 kilometers away from the village, so we decided to walk along the frozen bed. I fixed the strap of my backpack and stepped towards the river. Following me, holding the automatic rifle at the ready, moved Elephant after each other. We walked through unfamiliar terrain, vaguely realizing where we were going. Finally, we came to the shore. The time was already rolling towards evening, and to all appearances, it would soon begin to get dark. Winter days are short. We had to think about sleeping and look for a suitable place. But there was no suitable place. Suddenly, almost at the very shore, among the tall larches, I saw a wooden hut. It was so black from time that at first I took it for a big boulder. We came closer. The hut had once been pancaked from thick, large trunks. It was certainly a winter hut. Only long abandoned from time, the hut was almost window to window in the snow. In some places, the roof was damaged. The windows still kept their panes intact, but were boarded up. The door, oddly enough, was intact. I gingerly pulled the leather handle on the door toward me, clinging to the icing. The low threshold reluctantly crept open, exposing a dark doorway. Holding our weapons at the ready, we stepped into the darkness and stopped in confusion. Inside the hut was darkness. Our eyes fell out. Digging in my backpack, I took a flashlight and pressed the button and involuntarily took a step back. Right in front of us at arm's length, the flashlight illuminated a time-yellowed human skull, exposing rare crooked teeth from beneath a fur cap and a smile. Braids of long gray hair fell over his shoulders. It was clear that the inhabitant of the Zin movie was long and reliably dead by the color of the flashlight. I watched the skeleton from all sides. Apparently, when alive it was a man on a garment of leather and dense fabric. Decorated with a long limp were sewn several figures in the form of fantastic beasts. In his right hand, the skeleton firmly held an ancient KP strong gun with a long, living through the barrel. The left hand had fallen off and lay next to the skeleton. Clutching with his fingers a small axe, similar to an Indian tomahawk, a homemade knife with a long rusty blade, and a handle carved from bone was lying on the side. Beside the knife something gleamed, reflecting the light of the flashlight, a ring. It was very old and seemed to be made of silver. Not really looking at the find, I quickly put it in the breast pocket of my jacket. Without saying anything to the elephant, I walked around the skeleton and shone the flashlight, started to examine the room. On the left near the wall sheltered bunks, open with lice skins. Above them, hooked on a rusty nail, hung a tambourine with tied copper queuings. In the far corner was a stove built of wild stone. It looked to be in good working order. Near the stove lay a neatly stacked supply of dry wood. Near the window there was a table, boarded up from new boards. Everything was as it should be in a hut. I turned around and the elephant, not letting go of the automatic rifle, froze on the threshold. Obviously, he was not going to spend the night with this monster under one roof. Meanwhile, it was already getting dark. Gloomy clouds rolled the sky tightly. Spreading fine snow, I took out of my backpack a candle and a lighter, taked it to the table, lit it, and the room lit up with a bright light that gave it a semblance of coziness. Elephant took out of his backpack a piece of the presentation divided on the floor and neatly folded the remains. They took them out of the hut, intending to bury them in the morning. I built a fire in the stove. I estimated that there would be enough wood for the morning. I started laying things out one by one, taking them out of my backpack. The elephant opened with a knife and put cans of stew and porridge on the stove. Old nails were hammered into the wall of the hut. On them we hung jackets and weapons. The aroma of stew had already diffused through the room. Well familiar to all those who served in the army, I moved two roughly fabulous stools to the table. No plates. We'll have to eat directly from the cans. Carefully put the hot cans on the table and took out an aluminum spoon. At the same time, the elephant took out bread with a knife. I looked at him with a special look. A look only an old soldier can understand. May I? His eyes told me. I stuck my hand into my backpack, took out an army flask with alcohol, and rubbed the mug of flag la rotted and its edge. And soon the fiery water poured down his throat. Followed by me too, I applied myself to the drink of the gods, quickly chugging it down with key water from the other flaga. The elephant even stopped chewing, watching the process intently. Don't forget to exhale. The commander gallantly wiped off the regulars of the social parlors. My partner advised me. As Comrade Stalin said, life has become more cheerful. The elephant and I got more and began to get ready for bed. I paddled out of the hide and threw them outside on the bunk. Settled the staff, neck, jacket, putting my backpack under my head. The bed was ready. We decided to sleep by turns, dividing the night into watches. The night was restless. Several times I heard strange sounds outside. Every now and then there was a mumbling outside the windows, sometimes a wolf-like howl, accompanied by the banging of a tambourine. Anxiety grew rapidly in my chest. In the morning, slowly leave this place, this place is ruined. I did not wake up the elephant and sat up all night clutching my rifle. Toward morning, the strange sounds stopped. There was an ominous silence. It was still dark when I woke the elephant. "We have to get out of here," I whispered, putting on my backpack. There was no time for explanations. I took my automatic rifle, taking the safety off. The elephant looked at me understandingly, without asking questions. "We need to go down to the river and then follow the river. There is less snow there than on the bank," I whispered in the elephant's ear, as if I was afraid that someone would hear me. "You go first. I'll cover everybody out." I pulled back the heavy bolt, opened the door, and froze. Opposite the hut, with its back to the river, stood the blurred morning poem of the corners. A black cash register, a figure in front with empty eye sockets. In a bony fist clutched the handle of a knife with a bloody blade. A wave of animal fear swept through my entire body. Instinctively, I raised my automatic rifle and with a short burst slashed at the creepy creature. To my amazement, I saw that the shots had no effect. The bullets had hit the target. I saw it clearly, but the figure did not even sway. It continued to stand still and stare at us silently, as if I had fired blanks. Finally, the figure took a step back. Its outlines gradually began to blur, and soon it disappeared, as if it had vanished into thin air. For some time, we stood like a halt, afraid to move. "Why are we standing there?" I hissed, coming to my senses. "Let's go." We moved down the path with a quick step. When I left this strange place, I had to find a way down to the river. I followed behind, looking carefully around. At some point, I began to think that we were not alone. Someone was following in our footsteps. I'm not a great tracker, but I noticed the bushes trembling, crackling, twigs behind us. Sometimes there was a blurred shadow among the trees. I had the impression that the pursuers were not particularly lurking. We were already dying in the frozen swamps. When a terrible howl sounded ahead, we were deliberately pressed close to the swamp. Cutting off escape routes, we switched to running, trying to break through to the river. I had already seen the cliff, when from somewhere on the side of the thorny shrubbery covered with snow, a gray shadow rushed at me. The sound, machine gun bursts, cut the silence. It did not reach me. A huge wolf leaped away. It was unclear if it had hit or not. A shadow flashed again. I fired without aiming. It squealed pitifully. At that moment, I saw something black and shaggy coming from my left. I held my breath. I fired again. The beast buried its head in the snow. There's the cliff. And that's when they came at me from behind. Yeah, I didn't see that coming. I could hear the beast's stinking breath on the back of my neck. The wolf tried to grab me by the neck with its teeth, but it was prevented by a thick fur collar. It was impossible to use a machine gun in this situation. I threw away the now useless weapon and tried to pull out my knife, frantically fumbling around my belt, but could not find the hilt. The teeth of the beast were inevitably approaching my neck, and that's when I remembered the stiletto. Wrenched it from its sheath on my hip and stabbed it back with all my might, from the bottom to the top. It hit us squarely between the ribs, and we collapsed to the ground. The wolf wheezed, his grip loosened, and I struggled to get out from under the carcass. He was still twitching for mushrooms, clawing at the snow. But it was clear he didn't have long to live. I feared another attack, so I did not hesitate to cut his throat. At that moment, an elephant ran up to me in a bush coat with a torn-off sleeve. But since he was breathing heavily, it looked like he had gotten it too. I picked up the automatic rifle and wiped it with my glove on the snow. A vague thought was going through my head, and then it came to me. Wolves. They're so smart. For an ordinary animal. And they were hunting us by the book. There was a barely audible rustle. A new character appeared in the clearing. Stepping out of the shadows of the trees, the red corners of its eyes glared at us. A huge wolf stared intently. The white light of the rising sun was building on his pelt, and it seemed as if the fur was cast with silver. My finger rested on the trigger. But the wolf didn't attack. He stood for a while longer, and then turned leisurely and seemed to disappear into the taiga. We were still standing with the elephant, breathing heavily, trying to collect ourselves after the fight, as a ringing dog barking was heard from the river. 3 surrounded Nart, mated with dogs, were passing us along the frozen river towards Razdolnoy. I raised my automatic rifle and fired several times into the air. By evening, we were in Razdolnoy. The next day, a hitchhiking timber truck delivered us with the elephant to the district center, from where we flew to the capital of the region in an old N2 called by the people as a corncob. Our native city met us with snowfall and cold wind. Despite the bad weather, everything around spoke about the imminent coming of the new year. Multicolored lights on artificial Christmas trees shone festively. Temptingly, new lights of advertisements were burning. People hurried to buy gifts for their relatives and food for the New Year's table. It is said that one should never leave the year unfinished. My elephant, and I knew this tradition well, and decided to find a customer for our Tega Odyssey. We pushed the automata back to Razdolnoy. A local amateur bought them for a good price. With this money, we were able to buy tickets home. Everything else, including the knives, we managed to spend in our luggage. There was even enough for a cab from the airport to our temporary haven. I got there when it was already dark. The lot was snowed in, and there were no tracks to the house in sight. I ballooned over the door. The key was in place. Soon the stove was humming merrily. I made myself whatever dinner I could from what I found in the refrigerator and sat down in a chair opposite the stove. Kathy was gone. Judging by the fact that there weren't any of her things in the room, she'd been gone quite a while, probably right after we broke up. Was I upset? It was a little sad that nothing is permanent in my life. Sooner or later things leave me. So Kathy left too. I poured some vodka and pulled out a classic pickle from the bathhouse. Well, be well. Suddenly I remembered my find in the abandoned ranch. I took the trophy ring out of my jacket pocket and carefully placed it on my palm, trying to determine its weight. It was clearly a man's ring. In the old days, silver was always considered a masculine metal, unlike gold, a feminine metal. I turned on the table lamp and scrutinized the ring. It was a solid ring, no special frills. An equilateral cross in a circle, obviously without religious connotations. In the center of the cross is a convex circle, similar to the urban. Between the crossbars of the cross is poured in places by sections of time black and red enamel. In general, it all looked very much like a shield. Most likely, it was some symbol, the meaning of which I was not destined to understand. I moved the ring away from my eyes. It looks beautiful. Will I ever find out how this ring ended up in the hut? Who made it and to whom it belonged? I don't think it was the man whose remains we found. This ring doesn't match his supposed appearance. But who knows? Looks can be deceiving. I couldn't take my eyes off the ring like I was mesmerized. And somewhere inside me, I suddenly began to feel fear. I couldn't figure out what was wrong. I couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding under my throat. Fear surfaced from its hidden depths and clammy paws enveloped and bound my whole body. I shook my head, trying to pull myself together. And suddenly, as if obeying an unknown force, I put a ring on the ring finger of my right hand. Immediately it became hot. The heat on my hand went up to my shoulder and spread all over my body. Even more boredom and heart. I began to fall into a bottomless well. And after a moment, everything disappeared. I was sound asleep. I woke up to a knock on the front door. I looked at my watch. I turned my head. A strange man stood in the doorway and looked at me curiously. "Hello, Christopher." The man said hello politely. Yes, it's an unforgivable mistake. Not locking the door behind you. Intelligence, my ass. Could have been a nighttime stabbing. Suddenly, I was relieved. They would have wanted to stab him. I wondered if it was from the customer or someone else. I looked around the room. There was nothing suitable at hand. If I threw myself at him with my bare hands, he'd shoot me in flight. The man seemed to read my mind. "Christopher, you're in no danger. You don't need to kill or maim me." The man smiled. "John wants to talk to you. He's been here for a long time." "Did your grandfather come?" Yes, for about a week now. Come on. Is he expecting you? The stranger continued to stand in the doorway, making no attempt to enter the room. At that moment, his cell phone began to cry in his pocket. The man put it to his ear and listened in silence for a few minutes, then handed it to me. It's for you, Christopher. I heard the familiar voice of my grandfather in the phone. Come right away. We need to talk. Now you know everything. Grandfather looked at me carefully, and his gaze penetrated into my very soul. He rose from his chair and poured me half a glass of bourbon. I think it's about time. He set the glass in front of me. I poured the whiskey into my mouth without even tasting it. What my grandfather had told me shook me to the core. I had never seen such filth in my life. My whole being protested against the truth, but not to trust the only person I had left close to me. I had no reason to. I've been surrounded by betrayal and lies for the last 5 years. How stupid do you have to be to ignore the obvious for so long? And there were clues. They were always there, but I didn't want to see them. Trying to hide in the world I invented, I remembered my wedding with a bride in a white dress with witnesses, all rank and file. Betty's surprise at my family's visit. The joy of the lavish gifts. It's too fake, too artificial. Betty knew about the apartment and the car. She knew in advance and skillfully played up the joy and surprise. First lie. Then it became a habit. My long and frequent business trips, her love affair with Stephen, and then my father. The family mix. And she seemed to enjoy it. A wife for everyone. Except for the baby. It was a mix-up, an unplanned pregnancy. Could have been from her twin brother. No DNA test can tell. Who's the father? No. I got pregnant by my ex-father's horny brute of a father. So the DNA test in court proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the child was not mine. And I was blindsided. I mean, it was clear it wasn't Stephen's either. Who knew, you ask? Everyone but me. And Mom knew everything. Nothing was hidden from her. She knew and kept quiet. She was afraid of her husband, or she disliked her own son so much. How can you love one and hate the other so much? Betty, I can understand. What am I? A pauper, an outcast, and Stephen is the heir to a vast empire, rich and successful. There's nothing to be gained by living with me. A shameful life of misery and misery. On the other hand, my husband's rich brother and father-in-law. That's where a child comes in handy. Tie it to you tightly and enjoy life. What about love? Come on, we're grown-up girls. More money, more love. I looked longingly at my grandfather. God, what am I still pouring it all in for? My companion showed no emotion. I nodded. One glass wasn't enough. I remembered Kathy. And there's the lie. The failed kidnapping and the beating. The fake love and the passionate breakup. And there I fell for it. I believed it. Oh, right. The Savior's a romantic asshole. She listened to me talking to the elephant and leaked everything. And they got confused. They made up a tale about a stolen daughter and lustful kidnappers. The daughter was played by a fellow craftswoman. Yes, it was clearly visible at the camp. A minx is a minx in the taiga. I didn't notice anything. Batman. I remembered when Kathy was taken in an alley in Yalta. Very natural. It was painful, but gentle. Yes, Kathy was genuinely in love, but not with me, with money. I wonder if he ever slept with her. Probably not. It wasn't his style to get involved with a trivial war. It was all set up from the start. Except for the evil taiga creature and the wolves out there in the taiga, I was supposed to disappear forever, without a trace. No man, no problem. I remembered Camille's attentive gaze at our meeting in the restaurant, and his face was vaguely familiar to me. He'd missed the clue too, and he was a scout too. Thank God the elephant was real. Otherwise, I'd hang myself. I sat there trying to figure out what to do with all this. I felt like I was burning out inside. The door clicked, and a young woman entered the office. She walked through the office and stopped behind my grandfather's back. I looked questioningly into his eyes. Decide for yourself. My grandfather seemed to read my mind. There's a board meeting in half an hour. I think your presence is necessary. The owner and CEO of the steel mill stood up. Camille will help you pick out a suitable suit. Grandfather kissed his assistant's hand, showing me more than just a working relationship. Are you going to put me on the board of directors? To be honest, I was a little puzzled. Instead of who? You have no idea. Grandpa smiled for the first time in our conversation. It's for me. Did you decide to push your favorite grandson into a cushy position? I answered cheekily. That too. But not only that. Your father and your brother have been stealing. They opened fake accounts and transferred the company's money there. Good thing we managed to block their access to the main cash funds. Grandpa looked at his assistant. I stood up and headed for the door. The suit was picked up quickly. I put on a cream vivid shirt under my jacket and tied a dark blue tie. I stopped in front of the mirror. A glamorous office clerk looked back at me. Only the unusual ring on my right hand gave my image some mysterious individuality. In the hallway in front of the door leading to the small conference room, Stephen was excitedly circling. What do you want here? He hissed when he saw me. But I saw him in time. A glimpse. The disappointment in his eyes. Well, of course. It wasn't like I'd perished in the Tega. Unpleasant surprise. Camille ignored Stephen's hiss and opened the door. Come in, Christopher. Everyone was already assembled. No one knew me, so many looked at me in surprise, confused by the table. Grandfather got up from his seat and took a few steps towards me. Gentlemen, let me introduce you to my grandson, Christopher. Have a seat. Grandfather pointed me to a vacant seat at the large round table and sat down in the chairman's chair again. I have a question. I heard my former father's voice. Why is there an outsider present at the board of directors? Indeed, the grandfather was not embarrassed. But we will correct this mistake now. Standing behind grandfather's chair, a young man put a blue folder and a pen on the table. This is a notarized document on the transfer of 51% of the shares of the concern to my grandson. The grandfather signed the document in front of him. Gentlemen, he continued, I propose to introduce Mr. Christopher to the board of directors of the company. The members of the board raised their hands in unison. One moment, gentlemen. My former father raised his voice. The number of members of the board is always constant and cannot change. According to the rules contained in the charter of the company, we cannot introduce a new person at this time. Indeed, smiled my grandfather. I propose to remove Mr. Sebastian from the board. I was sitting in a deep armchair behind a huge table on a leather sofa to the right of the table. It's a little early for you to take over the reins of the company, isn't it? And I'm still in my right mind. Grandpa laughed. There was a knock at the door. Camille put a plate of fruit and a bottle of cognac on the coffee table. Camille, stay. Grandfather looked at his assistant. She smiled and sat down on the edge of the sofa. To be honest, I was a bit tense about the relationship between my grandfather and his assistant. Who is she, his mistress? That was the first thing that came to mind when looking at their relationship. But isn't she a little young for my grandfather? It was as if my grandfather read my mind. Camille is the daughter of an old friend of mine. He died tragically with his wife. A quarter of a century ago, Camille was taken away to a boarding school. Grandfather stroked the young woman's hand affectionately. I tracked her down, took her in and adopted her. She's been with me ever since. I was a little taken aback. Camille looked at me and blushed. Young man, this is not silver. The old jeweler pursed his lips. It's platinum. I must tell you the ring is very old, but you understand me. See for yourself. Boris Isakovich handed me the lupa. I trust you completely. I politely put the instrument on the table. Can you give me an approximate time of manufacture? Well, early 17th century. That's when rings like this were becoming fashionable. It was made by a good jeweler. Fine workmanship. By the way, the enamel is English of the period. So your ring was made in Europe. England or Scotland, most likely. I'd like to know who it belonged to and how it ended up in eastern Siberia, I asked, and put the ring on my finger. Alas, I do not know that. The old jeweler spread his hands. Well, are you ready? I looked at the elephant quite. When the elephant finished chewing. At that moment, the cell phone rang. The helicopter made a circle over its cold waters and began to descend to the rocky shore. The rotating blade swayed the tops of the spruce and pine trees growing along the shore. I was the first to jump on the ground. Then I took my wife in my arms. She flatly refused to let me go alone. The elephant handed me backpacks and weapons, waved to the pilot, and jumped out onto the rocky beach. The helicopter hovered over the shore for a while, then went sharply upward and rushed along the river. Soon the sound of its engine faded around a corner and a motor slipped out of nowhere. It turned toward the shore and soon jabbed its nose into the coastal sand. A man sitting in the stern jumped into the water and pulled the boat to shore. "Good afternoon. How did you get here?" He smiled welcomingly. We shook hands and began to load the equipment. "Well, let's go." I hugged and kissed Camille. Subscribe and click the bell.
Betty was still asleep. She had come home late the night before and said something about a friend's birthday party, though no one had asked her where she had been, but for some reason it seemed important to justify herself. Probably she remembered those times when her husband thought she was an ordinary girl who had no money or connections, but they were attracted to each other. Oh, those days are gone. Liam, as usual, took a contrast shower, wiped himself thoroughly with a towel, and began the most unpleasant part of his awakening. He leaned closer to the mirror, scrutinizing his reflection. This morning ritual had always been difficult for him, with fear. In fact, the tension grew with each passing year. Suddenly you will click the first marks of time on your own attractive face. What then? Good looks are everything, Liam used to say. True, it usually referred to work, because not fresh wrinkled flour is difficult to sell. You have to dodge to make them look freshly cut, but recently he more and more often repeated this simple truth in relation to himself. People are like flowers too. You have to work hard to keep them young and beautiful. Liam looked at himself again and grinned at his mirror double. Not bad, perhaps. He had bought another day against time. Good job, Liam. Way to go. Of course you can't hide your age. 40 is 40, and it's hard to look like a reverent young man, but it's for the best. After all, boys without mustaches are not trusted, neither in work nor in relationships. Even girls, yesterday's schoolgirls proudly declare that they like older men, but older, it is in their understanding smarter, more reliable, well, and with money, of course. In general, quite a reasonable choice, a man in his prime. Here he is in the pair itself. All the features of his face have retained clarity without becoming coarse. The contours are in order. The color of his face is fresh. This is, of course, the merit of an excellent beautician, but he himself is also good. Regimen, discipline, and zero indulgence to himself, that's it, the secret of his youth. Does not drink. Forced himself to say goodbye to cigarettes, plus a healthy diet, good sleep, and regular exercise. Sometimes, of course, you want to send all that correctness away. Eat a lot of junk food, drink a beer. You can't. His job is to look good, so healthy lifestyle, beautician, and of course, hairdresser. At the thought of the latter, Liam pulled himself a strand of hair to assess the condition of the roots. Yes, his freshly chalked hair had already grown out. It was time to visit the hairdresser. The usual Liam? Lauren chirped. To her, and only her, Liam trusted his hair for the 5th year. Don't ask, Lauren. You know better than I do. He answered, giving the barber one of his most charming smiles. "Just don't overdo it, okay? It should look natural, like you've been sunbathing on the beach and your hair is slightly burned out. Remember?" "I remember, my good man, I remember." Lauren ruffled his hair. "Let's start with a deep clean. What's up, sweetie?" He waved his hand tiredly. "Oh, Lauren, how can I be doing with a job like this?" Those who claim it's easy to live off women are either brazen liars or simply don't know what they're talking about. He considered his job to be one of the most difficult in the world and was ready to argue about it with anyone who disagreed. For some reason, everyone thinks that being married to a wealthy, well-groomed lady is Jack's sweat of a lifetime. But Liam knew very well that these ridiculous rumors were spread by those who didn't know the real truth. Liam's wife Betty was wealthy. She had her ex-husband to thank for that, who had not gotten greedy in the divorce, and beautiful enough for her advanced age. But Liam, being with such a lady, who provided him with an excellent paying job, lived in eternal fear that if he got bored with his beautiful wife, she would easily replace him with someone else, which meant that he would fly out of her luxurious apartment penniless. The prospect is hurtful and humiliating, so whether he wanted it or not, Liam found himself included in the pursuit of attractiveness. Cosmetologists, massage therapists, fitness trainers, all of this has long been a familiar, albeit expensive, part of his life. But external attractiveness is not enough. Liam has learned how to give beautiful compliments without repeating himself. He perfected the art of love and even learned to watch with his wife her favorite melodramas, and still, every day he began with anxiety for the future, which was uncertain, as well as the present. They say teenagers are driven by hormones, and that's why they have a bad temper, nasty to the extreme, but 17-year-old Thomas was an unusual teenager. At least that's what Helen, a charmingly slutty neighbor of about 35 who was despised by all married women, always told him. Mainly, of course, for the fact that it was she, the shameless and promiscuous Helen, that their husbands looked up to. The arrival of shameless Helen in their house was a real event. No one wanted to miss it, and the neighbors poured into the yard under various pretexts. Someone pretended that he urgently needed to wash his car, someone that it would be good to dust the carpets. Others just sat down on benches to chat and exchange news, but it was all just an act. In fact, everyone wanted to know what the new neighbor looked like, especially since rumors were spreading at the speed of light in their tiny town. Some noticed the strange woman in the store, others saw her strolling along the waterfront. So far, everyone knew only one thing: the stranger was young, beautiful, and excitingly lonely. At any rate, everywhere she appeared alone. When it turned out that the empty apartment on the second floor was finally rented out, no one had any doubts about who would move in. Thomas had only seen such a frenzy during the May holidays, when neighbors gathered all over the world, first at dachas for shish kebabs, and then for parades. Then people were just as concentratedly scurrying back and forth on the stairs, wives shouting something to their husbands from the balconies, and husbands crowding around, discussing important matters, how much meat and booze to take to the dacha to be sure to have enough. Thomas never thought that such a pre-holiday fuss could arise in quite, as it seemed to him, prosaic reasons, like the arrival of a new neighbor. But first of all, the furniture was being hauled by some men who didn't look like movers. Their clothes were too neat, and it was clear from their conversations that they were just helping their good acquaintance. Secondly, the new neighbor came in a tiny turquoise-colored car, with some intricate airbrush on the doors, whether paradise was depicted there, or just some tropics, the ocean shore, the setting sun. And thirdly, when this very door with the painted paradise opened, some absolutely alien person, boyishly slender, with long blonde hair, braided in an unusual, slightly disheveled braid, came out of the cabin. The tips of her hair were dyed in a fierce pink color, and the girl, who at first glance seemed to be a girl, waved her hand cheerfully to her new neighbors and shouted cheerfully, "Good morning." Yes, she is about 30 years old, if not more. Thomas's mom gritted her teeth. She stood in the yard, not far from her son, and pretended that she was just out for some fresh air. "How do you know?" Thomas whispered in surprise. "Look at the wrinkles." "Where?" "Under her eyes, you fool. When he smiles, his skin folds up like a crocodile's, and he's got freckles on his nose. You hillbilly." Thomas carefully looked at her face and did not see anything crocodile in it. If she had wrinkles, no one noticed them, but she smiled really well, openly and very warmly, and even freckles did not spoil this sunny impression. On the contrary, they even strengthened it, because if the stranger had a perfectly porcelain skin, it would be difficult to perceive her as a living woman, not a work of art. And the crocodile took her backpack out of the car, threw it on her shoulder, and walked lightly to the entrance. On her feet, as Thomas noticed, were snow-white sneakers. The men turned to follow her, but quickly came to their senses when they heard their wives hissing in displeasure. The hissing did not subside even after a week since the Apocal event. It was said that there was a brave man who dropped in on the new girl and offered to help her if she needed it. The pretty neighbor politely thanked the brave man and offered him a cup of tea and crumpets, but then some neighbor appeared on the landing. In a minute the wife of the desperate was already here, and the neighbors behind the locked doors listened for a long time to the shrieking and selected swear words. The essence of them, of course, was to censure unscrupulous women who had no husband and could not have one, and therefore offered tea to other people's spouses. They also censured men's malleability and promiscuity, because of which any lousy goat is ready to exchange his faithful and respectable wife for the first girl he sees. The scratch marks on the daredevil's face, as well as the impressive black eye, served as a warning to the others for a long time. The new neighbor did not comment on the situation, which made her even more famous as a brazen seductress. All that was learned, the name of this mysterious person was Helen, and she was apparently unmarried. There were different rumors about her. Someone said that shameless Helen in her youth was a prostitute and from the elite, and by 27 and 30 accumulated a hefty sum, which will allow her to live to old age without needing anything. This version was especially liked by women because it allowed them not to envy the neighbor, but to treat her with some leniency. Others assured that she still had some super-rich patron who gave her a decent monthly allowance. This version was less common, if only because there had never been any super-rich patrons in their town, and if there had been, they would have preferred to send their favorites away from here to avoid being the subject of gossip. But as was usually the case, no one knew for sure. The human hive was buzzing, inventing more and more crazy versions. The degree of hatred was rising, and it seemed to Thomas very strange. After all, Helen behaved very modestly, never once even tried to flirt with other men's husbands. But when going to the store, she always asked her neighbors if they needed anything. When a lonely neighbor, retired Betty, broke her femoral neck and spent almost a month in the hospital, it was shameless Helen who visited her with bags of goodies. And she also took to the veterinary clinic a stray backyard cat that had been seriously mauled by dogs. The cat needed surgery, and Helen paid for it without saying a word, and then took the poor cat to herself. Thomas, then a 16-year-old boy, observing the discontent of neighbors, only marveled. Why were they so unfair to this beautiful and kind woman? Especially women were fierce about it, and after thinking about it, Thomas came to the conclusion that it was all about ordinary human envy. Their house, their neighborhood, although considered one of the most prosperous in the city, but in fact there lived the most ordinary people. Women who were young and had first love got married at the age of 18 or 20. By the time they were 24, they had a couple of kids. At 27, they thought they were already out of circulation. They had tired eyes and early coarsened hands. They were used to thinking first of their children, then of their husbands, and only last of themselves. These women were young and beautiful, bent under the burden of self-denial, discarded in a kind of pagan fanaticism everything that they considered superfluous and too costly: beauty, youth, health. By 30 they had already blurred, changed into tracksuits for a long time, and tied their dull hair, which had lost its luster, into ugly bunches. They were, in general, glorious women. They loved their loved ones and dreamed of a better life for their children. Only one thing nature had not measured them for: a sliver of normal human selfishness. It was completely unnoticed as long as everyone around them was like themselves, but when the shameless Helen appeared in the house with her insultingly contented smile, gentle hands, and groomed hair, the women became offended. It became even more offensive when it turned out that shameless Helen was not 25, but 10 years older. And they did not realize that Helen was beautiful, not in spite of them, but simply because she was used to spending time and money on herself. Helen wore youthful clothes, and the most unpleasant thing was that they suited her. Helen had no children or nephews, and when tired young mothers dragged their sleepy children to kindergarten, Helen walked her French bulldog Curabere on a leash, and Helen never carried poodle bags from supermarkets. And never once did she look glum, resentful, or tired, which was a shame, because it turned out that she didn't have to devote herself entirely to others and forget about herself. I hate her, such a slut. Thomas's mother panted, frantically ragging the windows with a rag. Thomas knew that if his mother was cleaning the windows, she was in a bad mood, to say the least. Usually she left this tedious task to her husband or son, and if she did it herself, that was it. His father had a premonition of bad weather and tried to sneak out to the garage early in the morning. Thomas' nature in such an unmistakable flare denied, so that had to watch the mother explosions of resentment and if possible try to dispel them. Judging by the way his mother was furiously rubbing the window pane, it was not going well. And of course, the sight of shameless Helen, carelessly walking her Curabere, did not add to her good mood. No worries, no troubles, and plenty of money, why not take care of her beauty? Her clothes are so light, but how can you wear them in our dust? Only if you take them off at home and throw them in the garbage, because the closets are full of new ones. Oh, old fool, she's still at it, jumping around like a goat. Ah, it's disgusting to look at her. Thomas glanced cautiously out the window from behind his mother's shoulder. The neighbor was indeed dressed in a tight white t-shirt and pink jeans, rolled up at the ankles. Her sneakers were still the same defiantly white, standing out against the green grass. Thomas liked the tight t-shirt best of all, and it wasn't that the neighbor's shape was so strikingly large, but rather the opposite. The size could have been added, but it was so nice to see the chiseled shoulders, the flexible waist, and the tanned skin in the low neckline. Even from afar, it seemed that Helen gave off a wonderful smell of purity and some young freshness. "Get away from me. What are you looking at?" Her mother noticed Thomas staring at the woman and waved the rag at him. "Get out of here. She's not the one to seduce the children, you wretch. Why do you all hate her so much?" Thomas couldn't take it anymore. What's she doing wrong? She lives and lives. What does she live on? instantly the mother parried. She turned to her son, and her face breathed such a fierce, unconcealed hatred that Thomas was frightened for a moment. Hadn't you thought of that? She doesn't go to work. She doesn't have a husband, but she has men coming and going, sometimes 2 in one day. Do you understand now how she earns her bread? She looked hopefully at her son, expecting to see disgust or indignation on his face, or preferably both, but Thomas disappointed her. He shrugged indifferently and turned away from the window. But he earns money. That's a job too, Mom. He reached out to take the rag from her. You go get some rest, and I'll clean the window myself. Yeah, you've got another idea. Mother snorted. You don't want to clean the windows. You want to look at that shameless girl. That's all I need. Go and get some bread and a bottle of sunflower oil. Thomas obediently went into the hallway and found his dusty sneakers in the shoe rack. Once they were trivial white, but now they were striking unusual grayish-brown coloring, which means to walk on the city dust. Not every city has such, but they have, you can say, a business card of the settlement. Thomas slowly walked down the stairs, thinking about the conversation with his mother, about how little interesting things happen in their town if a pretty woman becomes a subject of increased and aggressive attention at the same time. And most of all, he thought about the white t-shirt of his neighbor. He wondered how she managed to wear white in this beastly dust. With Helen, he bumped into her right at the very entrance. Cora Beer looked up at Thomas with bright, round eyes and yapped in greeting. Hello, Cura Beer, said Thomas and bent down to pet the funny little animal. He wanted to say something to his mistress, but he wanted to say something witty, something that would surprise her or make her laugh, but nothing came into his head, so he had to limit himself to mumbling. Hello. Hello, Thomas, she smiled warmly. Aren't you going to the store that way? He brightened up. Can I get you anything? If you say the word, I'll be right back. Get me some salt, the woman asked. Let me give you some money now. No. Thomas was getting restless. I don't want money, but if you offer me tea, I'll take it. Then I've already offered it, she answered, and in Thomas's ears, these words sounded like wonderful music. He never heard Helen, amazed at the speed with which he had sprinted out of the entryway, muttered. If, of course, it was safe to do so, but Thomas was flying on wings to the store, thinking only that in 20 minutes he would be having tea with the most charming woman he had ever seen in his 15-year life. On this occasion, he made a promise to himself that from now on and forever he would consider himself lucky. He would get what all men from 14 to 90 could only dream of, and maybe even today would be the end of his childhood, because if his mother was telling the truth, Thomas was not a slacker on vacation, and he had worked almost all summer as a courier, so his savings could be enough, if, of course, she agreed. At the mere thought, his heart rate was giving out in such a way that Thomas seriously feared he would collapse unconscious right in front of Helen's apartment door. His palms were getting traitorously damp, and his back was already wet with sweat. Hell, if this was going to work out, he'd have to shower first thing. He rang the bell. Helen opened the door immediately, and Thomas was stunned to see her in her house clothes. His mother, like the mothers of all his friends, wore bathrobes at home, or at best some shapeless pajamas, which they proudly called homemade suits. Such suits looked good only on the day of purchase, and then on mannequins, and on ordinary women thin jersey, emphasized all the imperfections, loose hips and weeping, lost elasticity belly. And the neighbor was wearing a beautiful blue with a white ruffle sundress, tied at the waist with a beautiful blue ribbon. Her hair was carelessly pinned at the back of her head, leaving a few strands of it loose around her face. Where did she come from? I brought you some salt. Thomas stammered. At the thought that everything forbidden, adult, would happen now, everything inside him froze. Helen smiled and stepped aside to let him into the apartment. I had already set the table. In the hallway at the feet of the guest, rolled out from somewhere a fat, funny-looking Keurig. Thomas, blushing painfully, followed the hostess into the kitchen. Once inside the coveted apartment alone with this vicious, jubilant woman, he was completely confused. Just a minute ago, it seemed that he should only get here and everything would happen by itself, but now, he wondered, they would have tea, and then what? How does it happen with women like that? Do you have to tell her why you're here? Or maybe she'll figure it out on her own. And how do you negotiate the price? What if it's too high? What if he doesn't have that much? And most importantly, how to make sure Helen didn't guess that she was his first. Thomas was tormented by these questions, while the neighbor was pouring tea and thinking about how wonderful it would be if this woman was, well, just a woman, not a prostitute, and that she just liked him that way. Then he would put his hands on her waist, her back to him now, and slowly kiss her bare neck, and maybe try it. And Thomas, trying to stop the trembling in his arms, came closer and put his arms around Helen's narrow waist. Now he could smell her perfume, thin, fresh, with some elusive bitterness. He wanted to lean forward to inhale it fully. Helen froze for a second, but immediately flinched when she felt his hot breath on her neck. "Get away," she said, "or I'll spill from the kettle." He obeyed immediately and immediately removed his hands. "I'm sorry." He mumbled, "I feel either offended or ashamed. It's just that people say that about you. That I'm a prostitute and men come to me." "Calm down," she said. "Helen, sitting down." "I know, sit down." Thomas sat down and picked up a cup. Helen's tea was special too. It smelled of some strange herbs and familiar lemon, and for some reason a little chocolate candy. "It's not true what they say," he said. "Gossip, they always lie." The woman shrugged. "But men do come to see me," she said without the slightest embarrassment. "Only they have a different interest in me." Thomas looked at her with interest. Slowly his composure returned. "Do you really sell moonshine?" he asked in surprise. Helen laughed. Her teeth were like pearls, large, even, shiny. "No, Thomas," she said. "I'm a dressmaker. I make men's suits. I used to work in an atelier, but I make more money this way. Would you like to see? Come on." She led him into a room where there were several mannequins. One of them had an orange centimeter tape around his neck, and in the middle of the room was a table covered with patterns. By the window, where there was more light, was a sewing machine. "Oh my God," Thomas blurted out. "Is it really that easy?" Helen took the centimeter and deftly rolled it up. "You see how it is," she said. "They say a hell of a lot of things, but in fact it's very, very simple, boring even. Have you seen the movie with Monica Bellucci, calls Melina herself? It's also about such things, about gossip. Watch it if you want. It's interesting." Thomas left his neighbor's apartment thoughtful and sad, and it was not because the shameless Helen was not a mysterious priestess of love, but an ordinary worker. Just then he thought for the first time in his life about how evil people can be. And due to his young age, he did not realize that their anger is not from the heart, but from exhaustion, hopelessness, and constant spinning in a dull squirrel wheel. From then on, a sort of friendship developed between the 15-year-old boy and the grown woman. Thomas would often drop in for tea with Helen, and they would talk at length. Little by little, Thomas got to know her better, and now this woman's life and her journey became clearer to him. Helen had been born far away from here, in a lazy southern backwater where snow fell a couple of times during the winter and melted the next day. But there were apricot trees, and their sweet fragrance mingled with the bitter smell of wormwood. The stars on summer nights were so low that it seemed that you could reach out your hand and take a sparkle from the sky. Pin it on your dress like a brooch, and you'd be the prettiest girl on the street. You know, Thomas, said Helen dreamily, I sometimes think that's why I became a dressmaker. Because of this southern summer sky, I so dreamed of a dress the color of night, and that the star, here, on the shoulder, that even learned to sew because of it. The girl lived with her parents and grandmother, and then at her disposal was a small house with a front garden. Just her grandmother with age became hard to bear the heat, and then her parents decided to move her to the dacha. It was cooler there after all. In order not to leave the old lady alone, they moved there themselves, especially since Helen was not alone after all. Across the street lived her father's cousin, Uncle James and his wife, Aunt Clara, and their countless brood of 17 to 2-year-olds. At first, Helen found it a little scary to spend the night, and to live at all alone in an empty house, but little by little she got used to it, and then she liked it. After all, there were many advantages to being free. In time, Helen even began to be proud of the fact that she was now, you could say, quite an adult, even living separately from her parents and not reporting to anyone where she went and what time she would return home. Moreover, there was always somewhere to go. You could go to visit any of the neighbors and sit up late talking. Or, if your soul wanted silence and solitude, you could take a walk along the seashore. And just during one of such walks, Helen met her lion. It was late fall, she recalled, and it was windy, the sky was dark as before a storm, seagulls were scurrying back and forth, shouting at them. And suddenly I saw him sitting on the rocks, long, curly, and thin, as if he hadn't eaten for a month. His eyes were big, you couldn't see from the light. His eyelashes were so long and thick, you could paint pictures of him, and he was a romantic, reading a book, and the wind was ruffling the pages. It's not true what they say, he said. Gossip, they always lie. The woman shrugged, but men do come to see me. She said without the slightest embarrassment, only they have a different interest in me. Thomas looked at her with interest. Slowly his composure returned. Do you really sell moonshine? He asked in surprise. Helen laughed. Her teeth were like pearls, large, even shiny. No, Thomas, she said. I'm a dressmaker. I make men's suits. I used to work in an atelier, but I make more money this way. Would you like to see? Come on. She led him into a room where there were several mannequins. One of them had an orange centimeter tape around his neck, and in the middle of the room was a table covered with patterns. By the window, where there was more light, was a sewing machine. Oh my God, Thomas blurted out. Is it really that easy? Helen took the centimeter and deftly rolled it up. You see how it is, she said. They say a hell of a lot of things, but in fact, it's very, very simple, boring even. Have you seen the movie with Monica Bellucci, calls Melina herself? It's also about such things, about gossip. Watch it if you want. It's interesting. Thomas left his neighbor's apartment thoughtful and sad. And it was not because the shameless Helen was not a mysterious priestess of love, but an ordinary worker. Just then he thought for the first time in his life about how evil people can be. And due to his young age, he did not realize that their anger is not from the heart, but from exhaustion, hopelessness, and constant spinning in a dull squirrel wheel. From then on, a sort of friendship developed between the 15-year-old boy and the grown woman. Thomas would often drop in for tea with Helen, and they would talk at length. Little by little, Thomas got to know her better, and now this woman's life and her journey became clearer to him. Helen had been born far away from here, in a lazy southern backwater where snow fell a couple of times during the winter and melted the next day. But there were apricot trees, and their sweet fragrance mingled with the bitter smell of wormwood. The stars on summer nights were so low that it seemed that you could reach out your hand and take a sparkle from the sky. Pin it on your dress like a brooch, and you'd be the prettiest girl on the street. You know, Thomas, said Helen dreamily. I sometimes think that's why I became a dressmaker. Because of this southern summer sky, I so dreamed of a dress the color of night, and that the star, here, on the shoulder, that even learned to sew because of it. The girl lived with her parents and grandmother, and then at her disposal was a small house with a front garden. Just her grandmother with age became hard to bear the heat, and then her parents decided to move her to the dacha. It was cooler there after all. In order not to leave the old lady alone, they moved there themselves, especially since Helen was not alone after all. Across the street lived her father's cousin, Uncle James and his wife, Aunt Clara, and their countless brood of 17 to 2-year-olds. At first, Helen found it a little scary to spend the night, and to live it all alone in an empty house, but little by little she got used to it, and then she liked it. After all, there were many advantages to being free. In time, Helen even began to be proud of the fact that she was now, you could say, quite an adult, even living separately from her parents and not reporting to anyone where she went and what time she would return home. Moreover, there was always somewhere to go. You could go to visit any of the neighbors and sit up late talking. Or, if your soul wanted silence and solitude, you could take a walk along the seashore. And just during one of such walks, Helen met her Liam. It was late fall, she recalled, and it was windy. The sky was dark as before a storm. Seagulls were scurrying back and forth, shouting at them. And suddenly I saw him sitting on the rocks, long, curly and thin, as if he hadn't eaten for a month. His eyes were big. You couldn't see from the light. His eyelashes were so long and thick. You could paint pictures of him, and he was a romantic, reading a book, and the wind was ruffling the pages. I thought he was reading poetry, but he looked at me and smiled. And that's when a 17-year-old girl fell in love for the first time. As always, at that age, without thinking, without calculating, and it seemed forever. I thought it was the end of my freedom as a girl. What kind of freedom is there when you're in love like that? Only to get married. Liam, however, did not share her zeal. It seemed to him that Helen's ideas about life were too simple and uncomplicated. The boy was ambitious and decided that his place was in the big city. That's where the future is, Helen, he said, kissing his beloved's flaxen hair. We can't stay here. We'll be like Uncle James and Aunt Clara. Is that what you want? Helen shuddered at the words. Uncle James was a frail man, barely over 40, but looking a shabby 50. Alcohol and lack of demand were to blame. He'd once worked at a horse club, and no one was better at getting along with any horse, even the most stubborn. He taught kids to ride and was paid handsomely for his skills. But then one of the local bosses bought the club and offered Uncle James to teach riding to his fat friends. Uncle James couldn't bring himself to accept. He hated the suddenly rich, yesterday's hooligans with whom he grew up on the same street, but only they suddenly, out of the blue, suddenly began to build themselves whole palaces, although yesterday they were caught shoplifting. So Uncle James was out of work and started drinking. His wife, Aunt Clara, was rumored to have been beautiful once, but it was impossible to see the former beauty in the now immense aunt, with a large and dark wart on her nose. She had once worked in a cafe, but when she realized her husband would no longer find a living, she had taken up baking to order. Aunt Clara always wore huge robes covered in dough and cream stains. Her hands were always covered in flour, and her face was always bright red from the oven being on. The numerous screaming offspring of Uncle James and Aunt Clara, and from morning till night, there was no one to look after the children. In the evenings, Aunt Clara would come out on the threshold of the family home, sit down heavily on the porch, and sit so long. From the absent expression on her face, one could guess that she was simply enjoying these infrequent moments of peace and quiet. Then Uncle James came out, swaying, and gently touched his wife's loose shoulder. "Let's go to bed, Clara." Quietly, he would say, and the woman would rise from the porch and go into the house. Helen's heart clenched with pity for this haggard, tired woman who must have long ago forgotten that she was a woman and her own, unrelated to the family's welfare, desires. The words "I want" had no place in her life. There used to be, of course, but they had been superseded, wiped out to blackness, and then to complete invisibility. There was only one solid thing going around. I must. When Helen tells the story, I went up to her one day and asked, "Aunt Clara, is there anything you need help with? While I'm on vacation, I can make you dough and roll it out thinly, and I'll make you a cream that you'll lick your fingers. Or do you want me to look after the younger kids? We'll go to the sea and swim, and you'll take it easy." And I'm saying all this, I realize. I'm talking nonsense. It's not the right thing to do. It's wrong. I don't know how to do it right. And Aunt Clara looked at me as if she didn't immediately understand what I was saying, and then she grinned and said, "It is better to go out while you are young, but don't hurry to get married. You will always have time to go there. But from there..." But I was a girl. I didn't listen to her. Helen's favorite boy soon rushed to a huge city and promised that in a year he would come and take her away. Letters from him came often at first, almost every day, then once every couple weeks, then once a month. He still promised that he would take Helen with him, but not as confidently as before. Then the letters had the feeling that Helen was for Liam, no longer the beloved girl he longed for passionately, but something of an obligation. Finally, without waiting for the year to end, Helen herself went to her lover to sort things out. But having arrived, she did not find him at the address indicated on the envelope. To be more precise, no one opened the door for her. The neighbor said that the boy is rarely at home. Helen sat on the steps for almost 24 hours waiting for her beloved. When Liam finally arrived, he was noisily happy to see the girl. "Shall we go home?" he announced. "What about it? You wanted opportunity, didn't you? You didn't want to be like Uncle James and Aunt Clara." The boy brushed it off. "I've realized a lot of things, Helen. I'd rather be like them than here, running around like a stray dog with no one to help you. At home, you walk down the street and everyone knows you. Whoever you go to will put you at the table and feed you well. But here, Helen, no one needs you. And people here are strangers, cold. You look like they're dressed well and don't talk stupidly, but their eyes are empty, like glass. And what did you agree to?" Thomas asked. "I did," Helen sighed. "And we went back to our streets, to our acquaintances, to Aunt Clara and Uncle James, married almost immediately. Liam? His name was Liam, my husband, did I tell you? I guess he was happy. He got a job in a store selling beer on tap, made a decent living. Alcoholics, they'd give their last drink, so I didn't do nothing. I learned to sew well. We thought about children, but Liam thought, and for some reason I didn't want to hurry. probably because I'd seen enough of Aunt Clara. Anyway, we lived peacefully, but a bit boring. It was a sleepy town, but when the season starts, then there's some excitement, and from fall to late spring it's boring. We're both at work during the day. In the evening we have dinner together, watch TV and go to sleep. On the weekends we go to the beach, if it's summer, or to the movies. And I'm so bored. I sit here in the evenings and think, even though I don't have kids, I'm just like my Aunt Clara. I also sit on the porch in the evening and look empty, because I know what will happen tomorrow and what will happen the day after tomorrow. I know that too, and the month after that too. So I realize that it is not in the children she trouble, and not even in the fact that the husband drinks and just routine eats, monotony and routine. I decided that it's time for us to leave here until completely rotten, but no way, I just start talking, and he is already waving his hands at me. Don't start, I've already tried that. You're talking about boredom, but you've never seen real boredom. Nobody needs you there, you live like an anthill, and nobody cares about you. It's like that. Where I was born, therein came in handy, to make a long story short, but I'm stubborn. I'll be quiet for a week, and then I'll cast my fishing rod again. Sooner or later, and the fish will bite, and the man he is from the same fish in this regard, not so different. Be patient, and do not give up in the face of difficulties, then sooner or later you will achieve your goal. I do not even remember how many times I have already asked Liam, let's try again, let's move to a big city, and there are already 2 of us. It would be easier with 2, so I asked, and finally he agreed. We are packing, I remember, and suddenly Aunt Clara, but it never happened, she came to visit. She's looking at our bags, looking at them. I was waiting for her to drop a word, but she kept silent, sitting there drinking tea and watching me shoving the last one into the bags. And then he drank his tea, and then he said, "You're running from the wrong place, Helen, and to the wrong place." So she left without saying anything else, and I didn't think about her words. Why should I? At that time it seemed to me that I knew better where to run to and from. The next day we moved out. Liam's husband seemed to accept, but not cheerful, and I do not care. I think, well, here we are out of the swamp and crawled out. Now we will live. Of course, no one was waiting for us there, but it's kind of okay. I got a job in an atelier. My husband went to a computer hardware store as a consultant. He was even interested. He learned a lot of new things. It's not beer diluted with water. We seem to be living all right. There is no fun, but there is no boredom either. It's a different environment, different people. Yes, while you get to know the city, even that time will pass, and it's just that the people there are quicker, so they all run around, tearing their shoes off on the run. And the main thing is that they always have something to do, and we are used to living in such a relaxed way. Well, all in all, it wasn't bad. I, however, began to realize that my husband is not the same passion, and we with him spread out, or something, in different directions. Even in a simple thing, before under one blanket slept under one blanket, and it was good for us. But here we wrap each in his own, as you know, caterpillars, silkworms, and each in his cocoon sits. I even began to think that maybe it's really time for us to have a baby. We'll have such a common care. It also brings us closer, but I thought about it too long. I had to think faster, because the word of my spouse in this life, there are already quite other interests, not related to me. Rumors began to reach me, because my atelier was right in front of his store, and there on the first floor was a cafe, snack bar. Girls from the atelier ran there for snacks. They told me an amazing story that my virtuous husband had found someone. The girl and he said, well, quite young, maybe 18 years old, and I was already 30. So it was a shame, wasn't it? Well, she was pretty, like a doll. I saw her. Her face was narrow, but her eyes were half her face and blue. It's creepy. It's such a pure color. Her lips are a bow. Her hair is red with gold, and it's long all the way down to her waist, shorter and curly. She's so beautiful. How could I compare to her? Thomas, admiring Helen, thought that she was in vain. He himself had never seen a woman who seemed more beautiful to him, but the neighbor continued. Liam, he went crazy about her. He would come home and look at me, but he couldn't see me. I try to say something to him, but he doesn't hear. Then he wakes up somehow, remembers that I'm here, looks at me and asks me in a surprised way, "Hey, did you say something?" Well, I tolerated it. Then once I went to my husband in the store, and there it means it. Well, she in general. She saw me, of course they were scared, but I'm a grown man. Why should I fight with a little girl? She had nothing to be scared of. Lime immediately picked himself up, thought, probably, that there would be a scandal now, but I took the girl aside and calmly told her, "Why don't you like yourself so much, little one? After all, you're so beautiful young, but with someone else's husband, is there no single guy for you in such a big city? Or do you think that Liam is walking away from me and you won't? And what about her?" Thomas asked. Helen smiled. "What about her?" she cried, of course, up to her swollen nose. Maybe she was ashamed, or maybe she was angry with him and me. I took her to that cafe on the first floor, got her a coffee and a cake. Well, I felt sorry for the girl. She made a mistake, so why blame her now? Who doesn't when they're young? So she calmed down, stopped sobbing, and then she told me. She said that Liam loves her, but it's understandable, and that he loves her too, and it's also understandable, but the next part was interesting. He said he wanted to leave, but he couldn't decide to leave me, because I didn't work and had never worked, and I didn't work because I was sick through and through, and he supported me. And then this miracle with a swollen nose says to me, "You're going to die soon anyway, so let him be happy." Liam told her in her ears that his sick wife had no more than a year to live, and then they would get married. So she came home, sat down and sat there. I don't know what to do. I was thinking about my home, and I was thinking about the fact that the apricots were probably ripe and sweet as honey. About how Aunt Clara can bake such baklava, I've never tasted better in my life. But the recipe, I was such a fool, I never asked her. For some reason I remembered Aunt Clara, the very same Aunt Clara. So I wanted to talk to her, at least to hear her voice. I don't know how I found her phone, so I called her. Aunt Clara recognized me at once and started asking me where I lived and how I was doing. But then, of course, I began to describe to her, and what a beautiful city it is here, and what a view I have from the window to die for, and that my husband and I live well, and there is plenty of work and a lot of money paid for it. In general, I lied, Thomas, long and inspired, and during all this time Aunt Clara did not interrupt me once, and then waited until I closed my mouth for a minute. And then she went off without any preamble. "Now tell me the truth." Well, I had to tell the truth about my husband's Liam, about his beautiful mistress, and about what he told her about me, and I'm crying. I don't understand why I'm crying. It was not that I was offended that my husband had strayed, but the fact that I had been trying for my family for so many years. I had settled down somehow, and then a girl appeared, and I was to be thrown into the garbage. Like garbage? Aunt Clara says to me, "Do you remember I warned you? Don't be in a hurry, you're getting married. So you didn't listen to me and married the first one who looked at you. Come on, Don't mention it now. If you love your husband, then don't care. He'll have a good time there, and then he'll come back to you. But I'm telling you right away, then he'll go off again, that's for sure. If you don't love him, pack your bags. You don't need him. Aunt Clara had always been like that, a little wordy. She didn't like long conversations, but if she said anything, it was always to the point. We said goodbye, I drank some valerian, went to bed, and I thought, do I love Liam or not? It turned out that it was unclear whether I loved him or not, but where could I put my habit? I definitely had a habit for him, a strong one. When it seemed that no, I was addicted to him. I couldn't tear him away from me. I shouldn't even try. I lay there falling asleep, and I didn't find the answers to my questions, so I fell asleep, all confused and torn. I woke up in the night from the fact that the silence is so silent that it seems to ring in the air. A taut string is felt, and it is already dark. My husband was sleeping next to me, and he couldn't care less. Everything seemed so mundane or trivial to me. It's like it's just the way it is. I'd even thought that maybe I was just dreaming. Helen was silent for a long time. And then, Thomas couldn't take it anymore. Did you never leave him? No, she answered, looking as if she was surprised at herself. I didn't. Liam woke up too, and we talked all night and into the morning. He apologized, told me more precisely, even swore that he had no true feelings for that girl, that it was just a joke, and that it would never happen again. He even offered to go home again, go back to a place where life was easier. I was not very much against it. I realized that here, it turns out, the matter is what, even in a big city, or in a hut on the forest edge, and everywhere life is about the same. And if it's boring, it's because of us. So Aunt Clara was right when she told me that I was running to the wrong place. We slowly started to go home. We didn't want to hurry, and there was no need to. We decided that we'd be back just in time for Christmas. We'll clean our house. I'll cook delicious food. We'll sit down on our favorite sofa, and as before, we'll wrap ourselves in one blanket for two. We'll drink champagne and talk. I even imagined it, but it didn't quite work out. When we arrived, Aunt Clara was in black and couldn't stop crying. I went to her, and she told me that Uncle James, her husband, had died. He went to the sea drunk, as usual, to take a dip, and he drowned. That's how we spent Christmas at the memorial table. And then Aunt Clara told me that Uncle James, well, he was a difficult man, a surprise. He left the equestrian club, but he wrote down all his observations, developments, everything he knew about horses, what he had learned in notebooks. And the new owner of the club found them and decided to publish a textbook for those who are interested. And the textbook went viral, and this owner, and he was a decent man, came to Aunt Clara and said that all the uncles of James, posthumous royalties will be deducted to her, and the royalties there were not bad, believe me. At the wake this host was also there. I saw him then for the first time and was very surprised. For some reason I thought that there was such an old man nasty, but it turned out to be a normal man, even handsome. But the point is, we mourned our Uncle James and went on with our lives. It was hard for Aunt Clara. I went to see her every day, where I distracted her from her grief by talking, where I helped her with her eternal baking. Liam is at work again, diluting the beer, and then something happened to me. I don't even know how to describe it. I was walking home from work, and I felt like I was driving on a flat spot. I was leaning on a tree, and I could barely stand, I felt it. No, it's hard to stand. My head was spinning. The whole world was spinning in my eyes. I couldn't resist. I felt hot, even though the weather was cool that day, and I felt like I was standing under a hot shower. Then I sat right on the curb and tried to breathe deeply. Sitting was also difficult. I wanted to lie down, but I knew that if I lay down, I would pass out, but I was lucky. I saw a neighbor walking by, and he came running up to me, so scared. "Helen, are you ill? You look pale. Maybe an ambulance?" And I just shook my hand and pointed at my house. "Help me to get home." He took me all the way to the door. I kind of sat up. I got away. I went to the bathroom. At least I thought I'd rinse my face with cold water. It would be fresher somehow. And while I was walking, I remembered that I always had pregnancy tests, just in case. I thought I'd check it out, but it wouldn't hurt. I did everything that is required, put this stuff away so as not to be nervous, and I'm sitting on the edge of the bathtub, nervous. In front of myself, pretending I don't care. I pretend to wash my face, brush my teeth, comb my hair, and then it's time to look at the test. And of course, and there it is, 2 stripes, fat, clear rows. Rejoice, like Helen, you're a mom now, but I still can't understand. Not even to rejoice, but just to realize. Mom, I am now. What is it? What do I do now? Life will change, it's clear, but how it will change, and I need to tell my husband, after all. In general, I come out of the bathroom, the test in my hands. I hear Liam is already at home, on the phone with someone. Well and good. I think I'll make my husband happy. I sneak up on tiptoe in the room, so as not to make noise, and I can't think whether to tell him at once or just to show him the test. And suddenly I hear him, my husband, the same one who swore and swore his fidelity to me, saying to someone, "Why are you crying, kitten?" I had to go back, but you know I have a wife. The local climate suits her well, the doctors say so. But who am I to argue with doctors? They're not stupid, they know what they recommend. So we moved back, and then she wanted to come back here herself. She wanted to be buried in her homeland. It won't be long now. They've already found a place in the cemetery. And as soon as we bury her, we'll get married. And the main thing is that I'll get her house, and the summer house too. If you want to move here, you'll have everything ready. No, we'll sell everything here. Go to your place, buy an apartment and live. That's how it is. They're dividing my inheritance, and I was just about to congratulate my husband on becoming a father soon. I approached him from behind, and quietly said, "You can't wait, you bastard. And your woman won't wait for you, so pack your things and don't let me see you again." Liam jumped at my words. He's standing there with eyes like round, evil eyes. "You've got it all wrong. I'll explain everything. It's not true at all. You've heard it all." I didn't say that, and my eyes are running around, looking for something to grab onto. Ah, so he's standing there, shaking, afraid, and I'm laughing. Funny and light and easy, as if a huge stone had been lifted from my soul. I was even grateful to him for the setup. He finally took a breath, looked me in the eye, and smiled ingratiatingly, like a cat, which caresses, and he was thinking how to steal meat from the table. "Well, Helen, why did you forget all the good things at once? Have you fallen out of love with me?" That's when I realized I don't love him anymore. I don't love him anymore, and I felt so good. I'm standing there laughing, and I'm thinking, how happy I really am. I have a good job. I've got a place to live. I've got a child on the way. I've got rid of a scoundrel of a man. How bad is that? Anyway, I look at him silently, but inside I'm happy. And he suddenly says to me, "You've drunk my blood enough, and now you want to leave me without it? No way. If you want to go, go, but I'll stay here." I laughed again, and he ran out into the yard. I thought he was gone, But no, I was wrong. I hear footsteps. He goes into the house again, comes back with an axe in his hands and says to me, "Go away, or I'll kill you right here." And he looks so determined, but he's not giving or taking. And I was scared. I told him quietly, Liam, quietly, "I understand you." And I tiptoed past him on my toes along the wall, and then I ran out of the house. Right across the street, I ran to Aunt Clara. She was about to go to sleep, but when she saw me, she fell asleep. She didn't make any noise, though. She's not that kind of person. She wrapped her shawl around me and said, "My pie is still hot." She brought me to the kitchen, gave me tea, and I told her everything, and about the pregnancy, and how I overheard the conversation, and about Lion with an axe. I've never been so scared in my life as I was then, and it seems to realize that he has no rights to this house, that it is necessary to go to the police. But I'm afraid, I think, well, they will kick him out of my house, and what then? Stay locked up and keep my nose to the street. Maybe he'll find me somewhere with an axe, and then you won't be able to find the end of it. You'd have to prove it was him. Aunt Clara listened to me, and then she said, "All right, you'll stay with me for a while. Now go to bed, and then we'll see what to do." So I did. In the morning I woke up, and it was so strange. My whole life had turned upside down, and the morning came as if nothing had happened. The sun is shining in the sky, the birds are chirping. I got up and my head was empty. I can't live at Aunt Clara's forever, so should I go to my parents? But then I realized that I can't go to them, I can't scare them with my problems, and I can't stay here forever either. I decided to live like this for a couple of days, and then I'll figure out what to do and how to do it. And so the day passes, and in the evening I was surprised directly. Well, not a day without surprises. I didn't have time to recover from one shock, new miracles. I'm in the kitchen, Aunt Clara roll out the dough, and suddenly I see through the window, as a car to my house, and a girl comes out of it. She has her back to me. I cannot see her face, but the fact that I can see it is enough for a conclusion. She was a tall girl, red-haired, the same girl Liam was dating at the time, and Liam came out of the house all dressed up to meet the lady. Aunt Clara just looked out of the window, sneered, and said nothing. Then the cream knocked down, and I did not know whether to cry or laugh because of Liam's impudence. And so a day passes, too, and the beautiful girl does not leave. Yes, moreover, she comes out of the house in my road to meet Liam from work. They go for a walk, and I see she's wearing a familiar dress, mine. I don't know why she needed it. She didn't look like a beggar. Aunt Clara looked at this red-haired wonder of nature once, twice, and then she winked at me and said, "What a fool your Liam is. You found yourself an old woman with bling." I was stunned, I said. "What are you doing, Aunt Clara? She's young." And Aunt Clara said to me, "You understand that my senior doctor does plastic surgery on all kinds of women who want to look young. So this young woman of yours is a regular client of my surgeon. My daughter came to visit, complained about this woman, showed her pictures. She said, 'Mom, guess how old she is?' I then also decided that maybe 20 years old, and my daughter enlightened me and said, 45, Mom, she already has grandchildren growing up, and she's still 20 years old wants to seem. Her son looks older than her." I couldn't believe my ears. So this fairy has a grown-up son and grandchildren too. Aunt Clara is trying to kill me, she continues, and her ex-husband is also familiar to me, not distant. He is the owner of the local equestrian club. Here I was almost ready to faint. Miracles indeed. It was necessary for my Liam to choose such an interesting specimen as his mistress. And he says to me, "You do this. Go to your parents, and I'll talk to the owner of the club. Let him influence the former and your Romeo." I was hesitant, but then I decided to go, decided that I would not say anything to my parents, just pretend that I came to visit, and that's it. I thought I would live in nature, breathe fresh air. I didn't expect more. But I didn't know my parents well. They bought a dacha so ruined, you can't look at it without tears. I thought I'd come and see my dad fixing something there, and my mom growing cucumbers and tomatoes. Aha, so I come, and they have a paradise there, and the seashore from the window you can see, and their garden all blooming and fragrant. There are armchairs in the garden, a hammock for Grandma, a swing for Mom. Father even arranged a fountain himself and launched fish there, gold ones. Grandma, then in the hammock swinging, reading books, then stands up and goes to feed the fish. But that's not all. My grandmother's neighbor, a cottage dweller, decided to marry her. A noble man, a scientist, studying butterflies. Grandmother, of course, as a decent girl immediately does not agree, but the eyes that builds and look into the visit invites. I laughed and laughed at them, and I was amused. They are so nice, touching, cute. After all, grown-up people and even not young already, but so much trepidation, as if, well, here is the first love they have. A gentleman used to come to my grandmother's house in the evenings, and he took care of her like that. That today's men would learn from him. Then a basket of apples to bring her, then peaches, then bring honey tasty something, and a bouquet, of course. And not store flowers, half dead ones, but real field flowers. If you take them in your hands, you'll be dizzy. They're so fragrant. Every day he collected flowers for his beloved, and his grandmother set a table in the garden, a teapot, beautiful cups from the service, jam, dried goods, buns, beauty. They sit in the garden late at night, talking about art, about painting. Our elderly young man reads poems to his grandmother, then they walk along the alleys or go to the sea. He holds her hand gently, and the grandmother in a wide-brimmed hat, barefoot along the shore. I looked at their romance like, I don't know, like an interesting movie. You can't tear yourself away. You're wondering what's going to happen next. Well, 3 days passed and I had to go back, and I had the most interesting reasons for it. One morning, a dark gray SUV stopped right outside our fence. The owner of it turned out to be the owner of the equestrian club that the late Uncle James hated so much, but he turned out to be a decent man. So he came up to me, even bowed, introduced himself a little. My name's Brian. He's all dressed in a suit and tie, and I'm just like people at the dacha, dressed in what I can't afford, with no makeup on. Even my hands are smeared with berry juice. I was picking for jam, but it was as if he didn't notice anything, and I was treated as if we had met him at some reception. He says to me, "You, Helen, can go back to your home and live there in peace without fear. Neither your ex-husband nor Betty will ever bother you again. If you'd like, I'm ready to take you back right now." I didn't believe him, so I told him to take me back. So he drove me back to the house, and there's Mommy. Not just no ex, there is also all the minor repairs made, platbins on the windows painted, in the kitchen a new stove stands, and a small room under the nursery is remade, a crib, toys. So I thought, Aunt Clara, what kind of connections do you have? And Brian takes my hand and says quietly, "I want to apologize for my ex-wife Betty. We separated a long time ago, and she probably got tired of being alone, so she started looking for a life partner. Don't be angry with her if it's in your power to do so, especially since, as I understand it, you and Liam have already broken up." I nodded, and I waited to see what would happen next. I sensed that he hadn't said everything yet, and I guessed. He thought for a while, and then he said, "Can I invite you to dinner tonight? I think we might have some common topics of conversation. I heard that my father is taking care of your grandmother." Helen shook her head and pulled herself up. "Have I bored you, Thomas?" she asked. "I've had you talking. What happened next?" Thomas asked impatiently. The story had drawn him in, and he was eager to know how it ended. And then it was very simple. The woman smiled. "Brian and I were soon married, and I gave birth to 2 first-class boys at the proper time. My grandmother agreed to marry my beau after much beating from her beau, and Aunt Clara became a successful businesswoman. She opened her own pastry shop, and now she has 2 of her daughters working for her. But soon she will have to hire someone else because there are a lot of orders and not enough hands. Aunt Clara is also going to publish a book of her own recipes. How exciting!" Sincerely admired the young man. "To be honest, while you were telling me everything, I was more worried about Aunt Clara. How long the woman has worked, still pulling the family. Yes, she's a great woman." Fondly, Helen said, "It's people like her that keep everything going. And your ex-husband, Liam, do you know what happened to him?" "Well, Liam's a bit more fun. He married this Betty of his, and it was only after the wedding that he found out about his wife's true age and that she had a grown-up son and even a couple of grandchildren. This, of course, offended him terribly, and there were even rumors that he wanted to divorce her, but Betty turned out to be a cunning lady. She gave Liam a small business, a few flower pavilions, but the gift was very conditional. In other words, she made him the manager, but after the divorce, he could lose that position, and with it a lot of money. Who would like that? Especially if he's used to living large. So Liam lives with his Betty, runs a flower store, and keeps a very careful eye on his appearance so that his wife does not lose interest in him. And of course he succeeds. Wait a minute. Thomas interrupted her. "If you are married and have children, why do you live here alone?" "I'm not here for long," Helen said softly. "I'm just planning to open my own atelier here, so I thought I'd live in the city for a while, explore the market, so to speak. I'll be back home soon, and I'll be with my husband and sons again. You know what?" Unexpectedly, Thomas suggested, "Why don't you not sit alone tonight, but come and visit us tonight? I'll buy a cake. We'll drink tea and talk. Come on." Helen even choked a little from surprise. "Thomas, do you really think your mother or anyone else in this house will be happy to see me?" "They don't know you at all," he said judiciously. "That's why they're not happy. But if they knew how kind and simple you are, they'd love you, and you'd make a lot of friends." The woman shrugged. "It won't work, Thomas. I'm going home tonight." Thomas nodded silently and regretfully. He tried to imagine the town Helen would return to, and the picture was dreamy. He saw apricot trees and the seashore. He smelled the smells of wormwood and pastries from Aunt Clara's pastry shop. "I'd like to come and visit you someday," he said. "May I?" "Sure." She was delighted. "You'd be very welcome." On the way home, Thomas stopped by the beauty parlor. Now he knew exactly where to spend his summer money. "Did you want a haircut, young man?" the pretty blonde at the information desk asked. "No." He shook his head. "Tell me, can I buy a certificate from you?" When he got home, he made his mother pull away from cleaning and took her into the kitchen. "This is for you, Mom." He smiled and handed his mother a dainty brown and silver envelope. "It's a certificate to a beauty parlor. You can get your nails done, your hair colored, and these other things. What are they?" "Spa treatments." Mother looked at the envelope. "How much money did you spend on such nonsense?" she muttered. But Thomas could see from the smile that flashed across her lips that her mother was pleased with the gift, but she didn't know how to show it. Even this fleeting smile she hastened to hide behind her usual grumbling, as if she were embarrassed by this unintentional outburst of joy. "It's not nothing, Mom," he said affectionately. "You are beautiful at me, and all beautiful women must be pampered." Well, so that they do not turn into grandmothers. And only then he noticed that there were tears in his mother's eyes. "Thank you, my son," she whispered and hugged Thomas, ruffling the hair at the back of his neck. He thought that perhaps the last time she had hugged him like that was when he was a child. "You've grown so big. That's good, isn't it, Mammy?" He stroked her shoulder. "Now go get some rest. You want to lie in the bath? You want to read a book? I'll take care of the cleaning myself." In the evening he went out on the balcony just in time to see Helen coming out of the driveway, holding a carabier in her arms. There was not a soul in the courtyard, oddly enough for the warm summer time. The neighbor walked leisurely to her turquoise car and put her dog in the cabin. Before she got behind the wheel, she felt eyes on her, looked up and immediately saw Thomas. She waved at him, and Thomas read the movement of her lips. "Have a nice day. Bye." He raised his hand in farewell. His dad hadn't returned from the garage yet. Thomas peeked into his parents' bedroom and froze on the threshold. His mother was sitting on the bed with a jewelry box in her lap, going through her rings, trying on one or the other and humming softly. As Liam exited another of his controlled pavilions, he noted with amazement that it was beginning to get dark outside. Strange how. You don't get used to the fact that it gets dark late in the summer, and it's already autumn. You could go crazy. Liam looked tiredly at his watch. 9 p.m., so we'd have to stop at another pavilion and then go to the supplier base. Roses should be delivered today, and of course chrysanthemums. They're the most popular item. They're the first to be grabbed, and it's a hell of a delivery. It turns out, then deliver the goods to the points, and before midnight, he will not get today. While he's delivering, while the girls take the goods and report back to him. Roses trim and put to drink, with chrysanthemums more fiddling, cut, remove excess leaves, and then please paint them in all the colors of the rainbow. Customers like multicolored. Florists really are ready from the monotony of wool towel, and they can be understood. Girls are creative. They free self-expression. They want to create unusual floral compositions, and most often they are asked, "Over there those red roses, girl, pieces of 7 and wrap in cellophane." "Don't cry, my good ones." He comforted the florists. "I understand. You understand beauty. You want to create it, but always ask yourself, and who will buy such beauty? People are conservative creatures. They like the classics, proven virgins. It can't be helped. Creativity is either free or commercial. It's boring to play the same thing day after day." The girls sighed, but deep down they couldn't help but agree with the manager. Yes, boring of course, but what can you do? That's life. In any job, there's a place for routine, and you can't get away from it. However, Liam sometimes managed to amuse the girls. However, he did it in his own way, most often inviting them to cafes and entertaining them with jokes. For this his subordinates loved him and did not refuse to work overtime if he asked them to do so. Moreover, he himself worked late, which was mistaken for diligence. In fact, he just wasn't drawn to go home. Betty was already 50, and although she still managed to hide her age with the efforts of surgeons and cosmetologists, but her mood was the most gloomy, she more and more often held on the mirror reflection, gloomy look. Perhaps if there were a single person who cared about her, he would explain to Betty that it was this sullenness in her once childishly open gaze. those mournfully compressed lips that made her look older. If only she could remember again what it was like to smile with good cheer, she would instantly shed a dozen years. However, the beautician, a kind soul, decided to help her upset client in her own way. "Betty, don't worry, you look great." "Yeah," Betty said. "Great for an old lady." "You're wrong," the girl replied calmly. "Nowadays, 50 isn't old, but if you're so worried, I am." With a sigh, Betty admitted, "It's a shame that no elixir of eternal youth has ever been invented." Well, eternal or not eternal, there is a secret. True, it's not a secret at all, but not everyone uses it. You'll fall in love. You know, with doubt in her voice, Betty stretched out. It didn't seem like a good idea to get a young husband now. 5 years ago, she'd been foolish enough to get involved with one, and what had happened? Annoyance and fatigue, let alone a young lover. That beautician's a fool, after all. No, listen to me. Slyly smiled at the girl. First, a man in love himself becomes more beautiful. This is how our hormone works. All that blush on the cheeks, shiny eyes, worth a lot. And then, have you ever wondered why older men love younger ones? Because old goats want young, fresh cabbages, answered Betty gloomily. Right. Why? Simple. The painted finger flew up. That's a kind of energizing, youthful energy, you know. And dying of a massive heart attack during a lovemaking session is also a kind of youthful energy boost. And you don't bring it to such fanaticism. The girl was not confused. Why get so much carried away? Keep within the limits of moderation, and then everything will be all right. Betty sat sullenly in the car for a long time, staring at herself. So I should fall in love? Well, one of her friends, a big fan of young bodies, had said something about a new nightclub opening in town the other day, and she thought it might be a good idea to go there. After all, no one's forcing her to have an affair. You'll see, Betty, you'll like it. Kathy said excitedly, dragging her friend by the hand through the narrow, winding corridors of the nightclub. Why are the aisles so narrow? Betty wrinkled her nose. Was it on purpose so that only skinny people could fit in here? It's called the labyrinth. It's a concept. The concept. Betty grumbled. It's not a concept. It's all contraception. If a couple wants to cuddle, where can they go? You can't fit 2 people in here. Come on, Betty. My friend laughed. What are we, teenagers or what, to huddle in the corridors? There are other places for that. All right, don't grumble, look. At last the entrance to the common room loomed before them. The light at the end of the tunnel. Betty sighed with relief. The hall was made in the style of a shipwreck. Coral and countless shells dotted the walls. Sea waves splashed on the screens disguised as portholes, and colored schools of fish swam by from time to time. Instead of tables, dark, artificially aged barrels were set up. What are we supposed to do here? Betty asked. Carefully, she lowered herself onto a rickety stool. Rest. Kathy smiled and tapped the barrel. A waiter in a Jack Sparrow costume appeared nearby. What do you want? Beautiful naiads? He smirked. 2 dark rums. Kathy commanded. Double. I don't like rum. Betty hissed, but then a silhouette stepped out of the club's semi-darkness. Dancing? He said, leaning toward the woman. Betty looked into the stranger's face and was instantly drowned in his gaze, deep as the ocean and intoxicating as dark rum. She returned home that evening, cheerful, a little tipsy, and absolutely certain that she was beautiful. Before going to bed, Betty gingerly glanced in the mirror and suddenly saw a delicate pink blush on her cheeks and sparkling eyes. That beautician hadn't been a fool after all. The change in her mood did not escape her husband's notice. Betty was suddenly humming, smiling, even joking. And in general, she was clearly showing signs of a good mood, and she also stopped letting go of her cell phone. And she blushed femininely whenever she got a new message. I don't think they were from Banks. She had a lover. Liam thought and noted that, in fact, he almost didn't care. It was bound to happen sooner or later, and in general, it was not a disaster. Moreover, Liam was clearly holding on to this marriage, not out of tender feelings. His motives were of a different, purely practical nature. He had recently visited his hometown, and he had heard rumors that Helen was happily married to the owner of a horse club and had given birth to twin boys. That's why it was offensive. Liam was not so stupid to resent his ex-wife. His wife was certainly not guilty of anything. Rather, he was angry at the fate, which, as he thought, deceived him. He tried to organize his life so that everything was calm, stable, and in the end, neither of these things. Maybe the point is that you cannot allow your stability and peace of mind depend on the whims of others? Who knows? But that seems to be the point. As soon as I get home, he promised himself, I'll go straight online. It's time to look for a new job. In Aunt Clara's pastry shop, there was a joyous buzz today. The birthday of the hostess was always celebrated in a big way and even a kind of glamour. For example, today all the pastries were exclusively French and made according to some ancient recipes, and in the evening there was going to be fireworks in honor of the birthday girl. Helen was pleased to note how much Aunt Clara had grown since she stopped standing at the oven around the clock. Where had that formidable red-faced woman with the wart gone? Aunt Clara was now a pleasantly rounded woman, but no one would call her fat. Not even a memory of the wart remained, and her complexion was fresh, with a slight pinkish blush. Helen quickly found her grandmother and winked conspiratorially at her. The most important event of the holiday was still to come. Today, Aunt Clara was going to announce that after 5 years of widowhood, she was going to remarry. The man she had chosen was a respectable man by the standards of the town. He was the owner of the very cafe where Aunt Clara had worked for many, many years before her first husband lost his job. As it turned out, the owner of this worthy establishment had long ago been in love with the talented cook, but the fact that he was married kept him from openly expressing his feelings. However, a few years ago, his wife left him, and after the divorce was finalized, the owner of the cafe could no longer lurking to begin courting his beloved. And although at first they hid their relationship from everyone, but now they still decided to get married. On this occasion, the lovers planned a wedding trip, which they were going to go to right after today's fireworks. Helen's grandmother, who with her new husband liked to travel, personally made an itinerary of the wedding trip for Aunt Clara. Clara, dear, don't be stubborn. I've found the most romantic cities for you. Look, let's start with Prague. There you'll walk through pastry shops, taste all the impossible deliciousness, and you'll get recipes for your business. Then move to Vienna. Think music, waltzes, fairy tales. You can't find a better place if you want to immerse yourself in an atmosphere of wonder. And then, of course, to Paris, the city of love and debauchery. Don't laugh, darling. You'll need both in marriage. That's enough, Lisa. Aunt Clara Plunkett fears not to hear this outrageous chatter. But Helen knew her grandmother. If she wants to say something, it will be impossible to stop her. Clara, do not show off. I know what I'm saying. And after Paris, Venice. Here you'll find all the romance you want. Canals at night, gondolas, pigeons. and all sorts of stories about Casanova, who, thank God, lived in a different time. After that, you can go home and get to work. Helen looked at the night sky. Very soon, fireworks sparks like magic flowers would blossom in it. And most importantly, another happy fate would be formed today. Why just one? Two. Aunt Clara and her lucky fiancé and her children and grandchildren would surely be happy too. They all loved Aunt Clara, their precious, wise mother and grandmother, and of course wished her happiness. Happiness is every man's dream, something for which he overcomes difficulties day after day, for which he works and finds the strength to move on, even when it seems that there is no strength even for one step, and it comes to us in different ways. Aunt Clara deserved her happiness, and it came to her grandmother by itself, and to her, Helen. She thought about it and realized that she didn't know the answer to that question. Is it necessary to know it? The main thing is that all is well with her.